The third floor study room. My name is Kenji, and I need to tell someone about what happened during my final year at Sakura High School. I'm 21 now, attending Waseda University, but I still can't study alone at night without remembering what I experienced in that third floor classroom. Some people say I imagined it all exam stress, they claim, but I know what I saw, what I felt, what still haunts my dreams 3 years later. It started in October of 2021, during my third year of high school. University entrance exams were approaching, and like every other student facing the most important test of our lives, I was desperate for quiet study space. My family's apartment in Shibuya was too small and too noisy. My younger sister Yui practiced violin every evening, and my father worked late shifts as a security guard, coming home around midnight with heavy footsteps and the television turned up too loud. Our school library closed at 7 p.m., and the local juku was too expensive for our family budget. That's when I discovered the abandoned classroom on the third floor of the old building, room 307. Most students avoided the third floor entirely. The newer building had better facilities, and teachers rarely assigned classes up there. The fluorescent lights flickered, the heating barely worked, and something about the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, even during daylight hours. But for me, it was perfect, completely silent, no distractions. Just me, my textbooks, and the kind of focused concentration I needed to have any hope of passing the entrance exams for a decent university. I started going there around 8 p.m. every night, after dinner with my family. I'd tell my mother I was studying at the library, which wasn't technically a lie, just not the school library. The old building's main entrance was always locked, but there was a side door near the gymnasium that janitors sometimes left unlocked. I'd slip inside, climb the creaky stairs to the third floor, and settle into the desk by the window in room 307. The classroom still had all its original furniture, 30 wooden desks arranged in neat rows, a blackboard with faint chalk marks that nobody had bothered to erase, and tall windows that faced the school's courtyard. During the day, sunlight would stream through those windows. At night, they reflected my own image back at me like dark mirrors. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I made incredible progress on my mathematics and English studies. My practice test scores improved dramatically. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pencil scratching against paper, my pages turning, even my breathing. It was exactly the environment I needed. The first strange thing I noticed was in early November. I had been studying there for about 3 weeks when I started finding pencil shavings on the floor near the desk directly behind mine. Just small curls of wood and graphite, as if someone had been sharpening pencils with a small hand sharpener. I assumed it was leftover from daytime classes, even though I'd never seen evidence of the third floor being used for regular instruction. Then I started hearing the sounds. It began around 2 a.m. during a particularly intense study session. I was working through calculus problems when I heard what sounded like another pencil scratching against paper. The sound was coming from behind me, from the desk where I'd been finding the pencil shavings. I turned around, expecting to see nothing, and I was right. The desk was empty, but the sound continued for several more seconds, scratch, scratch, scratch like someone frantically writing or erasing. When I got up to investigate, the sound stopped immediately. I told myself it was just the old building settling, or perhaps mice in the walls. I was under tremendous pressure to succeed, and stress can make you hear things that aren't there. My mother always said I was too imaginative for my own good, but the sounds became more frequent. Every night, around 2 a.m., I would hear that pencil scratching. Sometimes it sounded like rapid note-taking. Other times, like someone erasing the same line over and over again. The sounds always came from the same desk, second row, third seat from the window. In late November, about a month into my nightly study routine, I decided to examine that desk more closely. During daylight hours, I snuck into room 307 and looked at the wooden surface. What I found made my stomach tighten with unease. The desk was covered in faint indentations, as if someone had pressed too hard while writing. I could make out fragments of mathematical equations, English vocabulary words, and what looked like practice essays for the university entrance exams. The impressions were so deep, they had gone through multiple sheets of paper, leaving permanent marks in the wood. But it was the dates that made me realize something was seriously wrong. Among the mathematical formulas, I could make out March 2018, written over and over again in different handwriting styles, as if someone had been practicing their penmanship. March was when university entrance exam results were announced. That night, I stayed later than usual, determined to discover the source of the scratching sounds. I positioned myself at my usual desk, but kept glancing back at the mysterious desk behind me. Around 1:30 a.m., I pretended to be focused on my English reading comprehension practice, but I was actually listening intently for any unusual sounds. At exactly 2:03 a.m., I heard it begin. Scratch, scratch, scratch. But this time, I didn't turn around immediately. I sat perfectly still, listening. The scratching had a frantic, desperate quality. It would go on for 30 or 40 seconds, then stop abruptly, as if the writer had made a mistake. Then it would begin again, even more frantically than before. When I finally turned around, my heart nearly stopped. I could see the faintest outline of a figure sitting at the desk, not solid, not clearly visible, but definitely there, a translucent silhouette of someone hunched over, writing intensively. The figure was wearing what looked like our school uniform and had the slight build of a teenage boy. The ghostly student was completely absorbed in his work, just as I was every night. His head was down, his shoulders curved forward in the posture of someone who had been studying for hours. His right hand moved constantly, scribbling notes or solving problems with the same desperate intensity I recognized from my own late-night study sessions. I sat frozen, watching him for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the writing stopped. The figure looked up, and for just a moment, I saw his face. He was probably my age, maybe a year older. His face was pale and exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His expression held a mixture of hope and desperation that I recognized the look of someone whose entire future depended on academic success. When our eyes met, his expression changed to one of surprise, then something like recognition. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he slowly faded away, leaving only the scratching sounds echoing for a few more seconds before those too disappeared. I packed up my books and left immediately, but despite my terror, I returned the next night. I had to. My entrance exams were less than 4 months away, and I couldn't afford to lose my perfect study environment because of what was probably just stress-induced hallucinations. The pattern continued for the next several weeks. Every night, around 2 a.m., the ghostly student would appear at his desk and begin his frantic studying. Sometimes he would look up and notice me, offering a small nod, as if we were study partners sharing the same space. Other times, he seemed completely unaware of my presence, lost in his own academic struggles. I began to feel a strange kinship with him. We were both there for the same reason, desperate to succeed in a system that offered little room for failure. Whatever had happened to him, whoever he had been, we shared the same fears and pressures. It was during the first week of December that I learned his identity. I had been researching the school's history online, looking for any information about deaths or accidents on the 3rd floor. What I found was a brief news article from March 2018 about Matsumoto Hiroki, a third-year student at Sakura High, who had committed suicide after failing his university entrance exams. The article mentioned that he had been found in an unused classroom on the 3rd floor of the old building, room 307. According to the article, Hiroki had been an average student who worked extremely hard to compensate for his lack of natural academic ability. He spent countless hours studying, often staying at school late into the night. When his exam results came back negative, he hadn't been accepted to any of the universities he'd applied to. He couldn't face the shame and disappointment. His parents had sacrificed so much to pay for his education and juku classes. His teachers had expected him to succeed based on his work ethic. The article said he'd been found at his desk on a Monday morning, having taken his own life sometime over the weekend. There was a note apologizing to his parents and teachers for failing them, and practice exams scattered around him he'd been studying even in his final hours. Reading about Hiroki made my nightly encounters with his spirit even more poignant and disturbing. He wasn't just randomly haunting the classroom, he was still trying to study for exams he would never take, still pushing himself to succeed in death as he had in life. But as my own exam date approached in February, something began to change. Hiroki's presence became more intense, more desperate. Instead of simply studying at his own desk, he started moving around the classroom. I would hear chairs scraping across the floor, desk lids opening and closing, and what sounded like pages being torn from notebooks. Sometimes I would find practice exam sheets on my desk that I hadn't put their pages covered in Hiroki's handwriting, with mathematical equations and English translations that were far more advanced than anything I was studying. The papers were always slightly damp, as if they'd been written with tears. The most disturbing part was that Hiroki's answers were often wrong, not just slightly incorrect, but completely misunderstood, as if he was making the same mistakes over and over again without learning from them. His ghostly studying had become an endless loop of failure and repetition. In mid-February, less than a month before my own entrance exams, Hiroki began trying to communicate with me directly. I would arrive at the classroom to find messages written on the blackboard in faint, chalky handwriting. The English section is too difficult. I can't understand the calculus problems. My parents will be so disappointed. The messages became more frequent and more desperate. Help me study. I don't want to fail again. Please don't leave me alone. I started bringing extra practice books and leaving them on his desk, hoping to help him somehow. But every morning, the books would be scattered across the floor, pages torn out and crumpled, as if he'd grown frustrated with material he couldn't master, even in death. The final incident happened 3 nights before my entrance exam. I was doing last-minute review when I heard Hiroki moving around the classroom more violently than ever before. Desks were scraping loudly across the floor, and I could hear what sounded like crying, soft, heartbroken sobs that made my chest tighten with empathy. When I turned around, I saw him standing in front of the blackboard, frantically writing the same mathematical equation over and over again. But instead of chalk, his writing was appearing in what looked like dark red ink that dripped down the blackboard like blood. "I have to pass," he was saying, his voice barely audible but filled with anguish. "I have to pass this time. My parents, they gave up everything for my education. I can't fail them again." He turned to me, his face streaked with tears, his eyes desperate and wild. "Help me," he pleaded. "You understand, don't you? You're here every night, just like I was. You know what it's like." I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. He was trapped in an endless cycle of academic failure, doomed to repeat his studying for eternity, without ever achieving the success he craved. "Hiroki," I said quietly, "you don't have to keep trying. It's okay to rest." His expression crumbled. "I can't rest. Not until I pass. Not until I make them proud." That's when I understood. Hiroki's spirit wasn't just haunting the classroom, it was trapped by his own perfectionism and the unbearable pressure to succeed. He couldn't move on because he couldn't accept failure, even in death. I never went back to room 307. I spent my final 3 nights before the entrance exam studying at home, despite the noise and distractions. When exam day came, I performed reasonably well, not brilliantly, but enough to get accepted to a decent university. But I can't forget about Hiroki. Even now, 3 years later, I sometimes wonder if he's still there, sitting at that desk in the dark classroom, frantically studying for exams he'll never pass, still trapped by the same academic pressures that drove him to take his own life. I heard from an underclassman that room 307 was permanently sealed after several students reported disturbing incidents during late-night study sessions. The school administration claimed it was due to structural concerns, but I suspect they knew the truth about what was happening up there. Sometimes, when I'm studying late at night in my university dorm, I hear the faint sound of pencil scratching against paper. I look around, but I'm always alone. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe some connections, once formed, can never be completely broken. I think about Hiroki often, especially during exam periods. I think about the pressure we put on ourselves and each other to succeed, and what happens when that pressure becomes too much to bear. I think about all the students who are studying alone right now, pushing themselves beyond their limits, and I hope they remember that there are more important things than test scores. I hope they remember that failure isn't the end of the world, even though it sometimes feels that way. And I hope that someday, somehow, Hiroki will finally be able to put down his pencil and rest. Room 2, B's Extra Desk. My name is Yamada Akiko, and I've been teaching at Meiji High School for 15 years. In all that time, I've never experienced anything that challenged my rational worldview quite like what happened in Room 2B during the spring semester of 2022. Even now, 2 years later, I still count the desks in my classroom every morning, and I still feel a chill when I see that familiar figure in the third row. I should start with some background about our school's structure. Meiji High is a typical public school in suburban Tokyo, built in the 1970s with the standard concrete architecture of that era. The building has 3 floors, with classrooms arranged in long corridors that face the central courtyard. Room 2B is on the 2nd floor. 4th door from the stairwell, nothing particularly special about its location or layout. Each homeroom at our school is designed to accommodate exactly 30 students, which is the standard class size according to Ministry of Education guidelines. The desks are arranged in 6 rows of 5, with a teacher's desk at the front and storage cabinets along the back wall. It's a configuration I've worked with for my entire teaching career. So when I first noticed that room 2B consistently had 31 desks instead of 30, I assumed it was a simple mistake by the maintenance staff. Perhaps they'd moved furniture from another classroom during summer cleaning and forgotten to remove the extra desk. It happens more often than you'd think in a school this size. The extra desk was positioned in the 3rd row, 2nd seat from the window. It was identical to all the other desks, the same scratched wooden surface, the same metal frame painted that institutional green color, the same small storage compartment underneath. Nothing visually distinguished it from the others, except that it shouldn't have been there. I mentioned the extra desk to Tanaka-san, our head custodian, during the first week of the semester. He looked puzzled and promised to check the classroom inventory, but somehow the desk never got removed. Every few days, I'd remind him about it, and he'd apologize and say he'd take care of it soon. But weeks passed, and the desk remained. What struck me as odd was that none of my students seemed to notice the extra desk. In my experience, high school students are incredibly observant about their classroom environment. They know exactly where they sit, where their friends sit, and they're quick to point out anything unusual. But my 30 enrolled students simply arranged themselves in the available seats, leaving that one desk in the 3rd row empty, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I teach 2nd-year Japanese literature and serve as homeroom teacher for Class 2B. My students are generally well behaved, though, like most 16-year-olds, they can be easily distracted. During my morning homeroom period, I take attendance by calling out names while students respond from their assigned seats. It's a routine I've followed for years without much thought. But in early May, about 6 weeks into the semester, something strange happened during attendance. I was calling out names in alphabetical order when I found myself saying Nakamura Mihoko after Nakamura Hiroshi. The name came out of my mouth automatically, as if it belonged on my roster. My students looked confused. There was no Nakamura Mihoko in Class 2B. I checked my attendance sheet, and indeed, the name wasn't written there. But somehow, I had called it out as naturally as breathing. "Sorry," I said to my students, trying to cover my embarrassment. I must have been thinking of a student from another class. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the name was familiar. Nakamura Mihoko. I knew that name from somewhere, but I couldn't place where. The next morning, I made a point of counting the desks before my students arrived. 31 desks, arranged in their usual pattern, with that extra desk in the third row still empty. But as I stood there counting, I could have sworn I saw a figure sitting at that desk just for a moment. In my peripheral vision, when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to that empty desk. During class discussions, I sometimes found myself unconsciously directing questions toward it, as if a student was sitting there. My actual students started giving me concerned looks, probably wondering if their homeroom teacher was developing some kind of mental health issue. The breakthrough came in late May, when I was organizing old school records in the faculty office. I was looking through student files from previous years when I came across a folder labeled Nakamura, Mihoko Class, 2A, 2019. As soon as I saw her photograph, everything clicked into place. Mihoko had been a student at our school 3 years earlier, in the class next door to my current homeroom. She was a serious, studious girl with shoulder-length black hair and the kind of intense focus that some of our more academically driven students develop. I remembered her now. She was always asking teachers for extra study materials and staying after school to work on assignments. But there was something tragic in her file. According to the records, Mihoko had died in a car accident in March of 2019, just 2 weeks before graduation. She had been rushing to school early in the morning to take a makeup exam for Japanese literature. My subject when a truck ran a red light and struck the taxi she was riding in. The file contained additional details that made my heart heavy. Mihoko had missed the original exam due to a fever, but she was desperate to take the makeup test because her overall grade in my subject would determine whether she qualified for her preferred university. She had been an excellent student, but that one missed exam threatened her entire academic future. According to the accident report, she died on impact, still clutching her study materials. The makeup exam she never got to take was found scattered around the wreckage, pages covered in her careful notes and practice essays. Reading about Mihoko's death explained so much about what I'd been experiencing in room 2B. The extra desk, the phantom attendance call, the sense of a student sitting where no one should be, it all pointed to one disturbing conclusion. Somehow, Mihoko's spirit had found its way to my classroom, still trying to take the exam that had cost her life. That night, I decided to test my theory. I stayed late at school and went to room 2B around the same time Mihoko would have arrived for her makeup exam, 7:30 a.m. The building was quiet and mostly empty, with just a few teachers preparing for the day ahead. I sat at my desk and watched the third row, second seat from the window. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, gradually, I began to see her. She materialized slowly, like an image developing on photographic paper. First, just an outline, then more solid details. Mihoko was wearing our standard school uniform white blouse, navy skirt, red ribbon tie. Her hair was neatly combed, and she carried the same canvas school bag that most of our students use. But what struck me most was her expression. She looked exactly as I remembered her: serious, focused, with that slight tension around her eyes that spoke of academic pressure. She was completely absorbed in her work, head down, writing steadily on papers I couldn't quite see clearly. She was taking her exam. 3 years after her death, she was still trying to complete the test she died trying to reach. I watched her for nearly an hour. Her concentration was absolute. She never looked up, never paused, never seemed aware of my presence. Her pencil moved constantly across the paper, sometimes pausing as she considered a difficult question, then resuming with renewed intensity. When the school's morning bell rang at 8:30, she looked up suddenly, as if startled by the sound. For a moment, our eyes met across the classroom. Her expression was one of confusion and mild panic, the look of a student who realizes time is running out. Then she began to fade, becoming translucent again before disappearing entirely. But her desk remained, and I could see the faint impressions her pencil had left on papers that existed in some realm between the living and the dead. Over the following weeks, I made a habit of arriving early to observe Mihoko's ghostly study sessions. She appeared every morning at 7:30 sharp and worked intensively until the bell rang. Her routine never varied. She would pull out her study materials, arrange them carefully on her desk, then begin writing with the desperate focus of someone whose future depends on their performance. What made her presence particularly heartbreaking was the obvious care she put into her work. Even as a spirit, she maintained the same meticulous handwriting and thoughtful approach to essay questions that had made her such a dedicated student in life. She was still striving for the academic excellence that had driven her to take that fatal taxi ride. I began to wonder if there was some way I could help her find peace. According to Buddhist beliefs that my grandmother had taught me, spirits sometimes remain attached to the physical world when they have unfinished business. Mihoko's unfinished business was clearly that makeup exam. But how do you grade the work of a ghost? How do you provide closure to someone who exists between worlds? I decided to consult with Fujita-sensei, our school's elderly Japanese literature teacher, who had been at Meiji High for over 30 years. He had a reputation for being knowledgeable about traditional spiritual practices, and I hoped he might have some insight. When I told him about Mihoko's appearances, he nodded gravely and wasn't surprised at all. Students who die with strong academic attachments sometimes remain bound to schools, he explained. Their dedication becomes a chain that prevents them from moving on. He suggested I try a Buddhist ritual called kuyo, a memorial service to honor the deceased and help their spirit find peace. But he warned me that it might not be enough. Some spirits, he said, are trapped not by external forces, but by their own perfectionism. They can't accept anything less than the completion they seek. I performed the kuyo ritual in room 2B one evening after school, burning incense and offering prayers for Mihoko's peaceful transition. I spoke to her spirit, explaining that her academic worth was already proven, that she didn't need to keep taking the same exam over and over. The next morning, she appeared as usual at 7:30. But something was different. Instead of immediately beginning her exam work, she looked directly at me. Her expression held a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Yamada-sensei," she said, her voice barely audible, like wind through autumn leaves. "I need to finish. I need to show that I could have passed." "You were already an excellent student, Mihoko," I replied. "You don't need to prove anything more." She shook her head. "I let everyone down. My parents, my teachers, myself. I have to complete this exam." I realized then that my ritual hadn't freed her, it had simply made communication possible. Mihoko wasn't trapped by supernatural forces or unfinished business in the traditional sense. She was trapped by her own inability to accept imperfection, by the academic pressure that had defined her entire existence. In the weeks that followed, I tried various approaches to help her find peace. I brought in copies of her old exams from her file, showing her the excellent grades she'd already earned. I explained that missing one exam wouldn't have prevented her from graduating or attending university. I even consulted with a Buddhist priest who specialized in helping troubled spirits. But nothing worked. Every morning, Mihoko continued her eternal exam, writing answers to questions that would never be graded, striving for a perfection that death had made impossible. The situation reached a crisis point in early June when I noticed that some of my living students were being affected by Mihoko's presence. Several students who sat near her empty desk began showing signs of extreme academic anxiety. They became obsessed with perfection, staying up all night to study and breaking down in tears over minor mistakes. It was as if Mihoko's desperate perfectionism was bleeding into the living world, infecting my students with the same academic pressure that had trapped her spirit. I realized I had to do something more decisive. If I couldn't help Mihoko move on, I had to at least protect my living students from her influence. With Fujita sensei's help, I performed a more elaborate ritual, not to banish Mihoko, but to contain her presence to times when living students weren't in the classroom. We placed protective omamori charms around the room and created a spiritual barrier that would limit her manifestations to early morning hours when the classroom was empty. The ritual worked, partially. Mihoko still appears every morning to take her eternal exam, but her influence no longer affects my living students. The extra desk remains in room 2B. Removing it now feels like it would be disrespectful to her memory, but during class hours, it's just empty furniture. Sometimes, when I'm grading papers late in the evening, I can sense her presence, a student still working diligently in the corner of my vision. I've learned to coexist with her dedication, even as I mourn the academic pressure that created it. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've seen how the pursuit of academic perfection can consume students' lives. Mihoko's spirit serves as a constant reminder of what happens when that pursuit becomes more important than life itself. My students don't know about their ghostly classmate, but I think some of them sense something. They're a little more relaxed in room 2B than students in other classes, a little less obsessed with perfect grades. Maybe Mihoko's presence, contained though it is, serves as a subtle warning about the dangers of academic pressure. I still count 31 desks every morning, and I still see her there in the early hours, bent over her eternal exam. Part of me hopes that someday she'll finally be satisfied with her work and find the peace that eluded her in life. But another part of me suspects that some forms of perfectionism are too deeply ingrained to ever truly release their hold. Mihoko may be taking that makeup exam for eternity, forever striving for an academic achievement that death has made meaningless. I've learned to accept her presence as part of Room 2B's character. She's become, in a way, my most dedicated. The swimming pool lanes. My name is Sato Kenji, and I was captain of the swimming team at Kaisei High School during my senior year in 2023. What I'm about to tell you happened during our winter training season, when we practiced twice daily to prepare for the spring championships. Even now, 18 months later, I can't enter a swimming pool without counting the lanes twice and checking lane 4 specifically. I need to give you some background about our training culture first. Japanese high school swimming is intensely competitive, especially at schools like Kaisei that have strong athletic traditions. Our coach, Watanabe Sensei, had been training championship swimmers for over 20 years, and he expected absolute dedication from his team members. Practice sessions ran from 6 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. before school, then again from 4 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. after classes ended. The pressure to excel wasn't just from our coach, it came from our families, our school's reputation, and ourselves. Many of us were hoping swimming scholarships would help us attend better universities. For students from working-class families like mine, athletic achievement was one of the few paths to educational advancement. Our school pool was built in the 1980s and had 8 lanes marked by floating lane ropes. Lane 4 was positioned directly in the center, considered the fastest lane where our best swimmers typically practiced. The pool was 25 meters long, with proper racing starting blocks and timing equipment, that Watanabe-sensei used to track our progress obsessively. During my 3 years on the team, I'd noticed that Lane 4 seemed to have stronger currents than the other lanes. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle pull that made swimming feel slightly more difficult. Some swimmers complained about feeling tired more quickly in that lane, but we attributed it to the pool's circulation system, or maybe psychological pressure from swimming in the champion's lane. The incidents began in early December, about 2 months into our winter training cycle. I was team captain, so I arrived early to help set up equipment and ensure the pool area was ready for practice. During one of these early morning sessions, I noticed movement in the pool before any team members had arrived. Swimming in lane 4 was a figure I didn't immediately recognize. The swimmer was using a perfect freestyle stroke, maintaining steady pace and breathing rhythm. What struck me as odd was that I couldn't see clear details. The figure seemed slightly blurred, like looking at someone through frosted glass. I called out "Ohayo gozaimasu" as a greeting, assuming it was a team member who'd arrived even earlier than usual. But the swimmer didn't acknowledge me and continued his laps with mechanical precision. I checked our team roster and schedules, but nobody was supposed to be in the pool that early. When I mentioned the incident to Watanabe-sensei, he looked troubled but didn't offer an explanation. "Some swimmers become so dedicated they seem to live in the water," he said cryptically. "Focus on your own training, Sato." Over the following weeks, I began seeing the mysterious swimmer more frequently. He appeared during early morning practices, always in lane 4, always swimming with the same relentless intensity. His technique was flawless textbook freestyle, with perfect body rotation and bilateral breathing every third stroke. But there was something unsettling about his consistency. He never seemed to tire, never paused between sets, never varied his pace. My teammates started noticing him too. Yamamoto, our fastest sprinter, mentioned feeling someone swimming alongside him during solo practice sessions. Tanaka, a distance swimmer, complained that lane 4 had become too crowded, even when it appeared empty to observers. The situation escalated in mid-December when several team members reported near-drowning experiences in lane 4. Matsumoto, a solid intermediate swimmer, said he'd been pulled under during a routine practice set. He described feeling a strong undertow that dragged him toward the pool bottom, forcing him to fight his way to the surface. Similar incidents followed. Swimmers would enter lane 4 feeling confident, then find themselves struggling against unexpected currents that seemed to pull them downward. 2 team members had to be rescued by teammates when they panicked and couldn't surface properly. Watanabe-sensei temporarily banned use of lane 4, claiming the pool's circulation system needed maintenance. But during my early morning setup duties, I continued to see the mysterious swimmer maintaining his endless laps, indifferent to our restrictions. I decided to research our school's swimming history, hoping to understand what was happening. In the library archives, I found old yearbooks and newspaper clippings about Kaisei's athletic achievements. That's when I discovered the story of Nakamura Hiroshi. Hiroshi had been team captain 5 years earlier, during the 2018 season. According to the articles, he was an exceptionally dedicated athlete who trained harder than anyone else on the team. His father had been a former Olympic swimmer who never achieved international success, and he pushed Hiroshi relentlessly to fulfill the dreams he'd never realized himself. The newspaper reports described Hiroshi's training regimen as inhuman. He swam additional laps after official practice ended, often staying in the pool until the janitors locked the building. His teammates worried about his health, but Hiroshi insisted he needed to work harder to meet his father's expectations and secure a swimming scholarship to a top university. The tragedy occurred during a January practice session in 2019. Hiroshi had been swimming continuous laps for over 3 hours, refusing to rest despite obvious exhaustion. Witnesses said he was swimming in lane 4 when he suddenly stopped mid-stroke and sank beneath the surface. By the time teammates realized something was wrong and pulled him out, Hiroshi had drowned. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, brought on by extreme physical exhaustion, but everyone knew the real cause was the impossible pressure he'd placed on himself. According to the article, Hiroshi's final words to his teammates had been, "I have to keep swimming. I can't stop until I'm fast enough." Reading about Hiroshi's death explained everything I'd been experiencing. The mysterious swimmer was Hiroshi's spirit, still trapped in Lane 4, still pushing himself beyond human limits in pursuit of the perfection that had killed him. But understanding the supernatural situation didn't solve our practical problem. Lane 4 remained dangerous, with swimmers reporting increasingly severe undertow incidents. The ghostly currents seemed to be getting stronger, as if Hiroshi's desperation was intensifying. During a particularly frightening incident in early January, our newest team member, a first-year student named Suzuki, nearly drowned in Lane 4. He'd been attempting a simple warm-up swim when something pulled him under so forcefully that he couldn't surface despite being a capable swimmer. 3 upperclassmen had to dive in to rescue him. That night, I stayed late at school and went to the pool area alone. I needed to confront whatever was happening in Lane 4, both as team captain and for the safety of my teammates. The pool area was dimly lit by emergency lighting, creating an eerie atmosphere that made the water look black as ink. I sat on the starting blocks and waited, watching Lane 4 specifically. At exactly 2:15 a.m., Hiroshi appeared. This time, I could see him clearly. He looked exactly as he had in the old team photos, lean and muscular, with the intense focus that had defined his personality. His swimming stroke was perfect, but there was something mechanical about his movements, as if he'd been swimming the same laps for years without rest. "Hiroshi Senpai," I called out, using the respectful honorific for an upperclassman. He stopped swimming and looked at me, treading water in the center of Lane 4. His expression was exhausted but determined, the look of someone who couldn't allow himself to quit. "I have to keep training," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, despite speaking at normal volume. "I'm not fast enough yet. My father is still waiting for me to improve." "Hiroshi Senpai, you've been swimming for 5 years. Don't you think it's time to rest?" His expression became anguished. "I can't rest. Every time I stop, I remember how disappointed my father was. I remember how I failed to get the scholarship, how I let everyone down. I have to keep swimming until I'm good enough." I realized then that Hiroshi wasn't just haunting Lane 4. He was trapped by his own perfectionism, doomed to repeat the same training session that had killed him. His desperate need to improve had become stronger than death itself. "You were already good enough," I told him. "Your teammates respected you. Your times were excellent. You pushed yourself too hard because you couldn't see your own worth." Tears mixed with pool water on his face. "But my father said I needed to swim faster. He said champions never rest, never accept mediocrity. How can I stop when there's still improvement possible?" I understood his torment, because I'd felt similar pressure myself. The difference was that I'd learned to balance dedication with self-preservation, something Hiroshi had never mastered. "Your father was wrong," I said gently. "Champions know when to rest. They know that destroying yourself isn't improvement, it's surrender." Hiroshi looked confused, as if this concept had never occurred to him. "But if I stop swimming, what am I? What value do I have?" "You're still Hiroshi. Still our respected senpai. Still someone who inspired his teammates to work harder. Your worth isn't measured by your swimming times." For a moment, his expression softened. But then the desperate determination returned. "I can't risk it. I have to keep trying. Maybe if I swim just a little longer, just a few more laps, I'll finally be fast enough." He resumed his endless freestyle, and I realized that some forms of perfectionism are too deeply rooted to overcome, even with death. Hiroshi would continue swimming in Lane 4, creating dangerous currents as his spirit churned through the same water over and over again. I consulted with the school's Buddhist chaplain about performing a memorial service for Hiroshi, hoping it might help his spirit find peace. The ceremony was respectful and well attended by former teammates who remembered him fondly, but it didn't change anything. The next morning, he was back in lane 4, swimming with the same relentless intensity. Our solution was practical rather than spiritual. We officially retired lane 4 from use, marking it with permanent barriers and dedicating it as a memorial to Hiroshi. The pool deck now has a small shrine where team members can offer prayers and remember the importance of balanced training. I graduated and went on to swim at university level, but I never forgot the lesson of lane 4. Athletic dedication is admirable, but self-destruction disguised as commitment is a tragedy that extends beyond the grave. Sometimes I wonder if Hiroshi is still swimming in that lane, still chasing a perfection that death made impossible to achieve. Part of me hopes that eventually he'll realize that his worth was never dependent on his swimming times, and he'll finally allow himself to rest. But another part of me suspects that some forms of pressure, once internalized, become permanent prisons that not even death can unlock. Our current swimmers know about Hiroshi through team tradition, and they understand why lane 4 remains empty during practice. His story serves as a reminder that athletic achievement should enhance life, not replace it. The pool still has 8 lanes, but we only use 7. Lane 4 belongs to Hiroshi now, and his endless training serves as both memorial and warning to those of us who continue to chase excellence without losing ourselves in the pursuit. The Guidance Counselor's Files. My name is Nakamura Keiko, and I've been a guidance counselor at Shirane High School for 12 years. What I'm about to share happened during the fall semester of 2023, and it fundamentally changed how I understand both my profession and the lasting impact of student trauma. Even now, 6 months later, I still check my office locks twice before leaving each evening, and I can never shake the feeling that someone is reading over my shoulder when I review confidential files. Let me start with some context about my role and office setup. As the school's primary guidance counselor, I maintain confidential files on students who seek academic, personal, or emotional support. These files contain sensitive information, family problems, mental health concerns, academic struggles, social conflicts, all protected by strict privacy protocols that form the foundation of trust between counselor and student. My office is located on the second floor of the administrative building, a small but comfortable space with 2 chairs for counseling sessions, a desk where I conduct intake interviews, and a locked filing cabinet where I store all confidential student records. The cabinet has a heavy-duty lock that requires both a key and combination code to open, ensuring complete security for sensitive documents. Each morning, I follow the same routine. I arrive at 7:30 a.m., unlock my office, check my schedule for the day, and review any files I'll need for scheduled counseling sessions. It's a predictable pattern that helps me feel prepared and organized for whatever challenges my students might bring. But in early October, I began finding my student files scattered across my desk each morning, not randomly scattered, carefully arranged, as if someone had been reading through them systematically during the night. The files were organized by severity of case, with the most troubled students' records positioned prominently at the center of my desk. Initially, I assumed I'd forgotten to put the files away the previous evening. The work of a guidance counselor can be emotionally draining, and end-of-day fatigue sometimes affects memory. But when I checked my filing cabinet, it was still locked with no signs of tampering. The combination lock showed no evidence of being disturbed, and I'm the only person who knows the access codes. The pattern continued for several days. Each morning, I'd find different student files carefully arranged on my desk, always focusing on cases involving academic pressure, family conflicts, or social isolation. The mystery deepened when I realized some of the scattered files belonged to students I hadn't accessed recently. Their records should have been filed away for months. During the second week of these incidents, I started noticing something disturbing about which files were being selected. They all belonged to students who were struggling with social rejection, academic bullying, or extreme family pressure. It was as if someone was deliberately highlighting our most vulnerable cases. Among the repeatedly scattered files was one I recognized but hadn't opened in over 2 years, the case of Yamamoto Yuki, a former student who had committed suicide during her second year in 2021. Yuki's file contained detailed documentation of the academic bullying she'd experienced, her declining mental health, and the counseling sessions where she desperately sought help before taking her own life. Reading Yuki's file again brought back painful memories. She had been a quiet, studious girl who became a target for bullying when her grades began slipping due to family financial problems. Other students mocked her worn-out uniform, her inability to afford school supplies, and her part-time job at a convenience store. The bullying escalated from verbal harassment to social ostracism, leaving Yuki completely isolated. In our final counseling session, Yuki had expressed feeling hopeless about her social situation. "Nobody understands what it's like," she'd said. "Everyone thinks I'm just weak, but they don't know about my family's struggles. If they could see my counseling files, maybe they'd understand why I can't keep up with everything." Those words proved tragically prophetic. 3 days after our last session, Yuki was found in the school's rarely used third-floor bathroom, having taken her own life during lunch break. Her suicide note apologized for being too weak to handle normal student problems and expressed hope that other students wouldn't face the same isolation she'd experienced. The guilt from Yuki's death had weighed heavily on me for 2 years. Despite multiple counseling sessions and crisis intervention protocols, I hadn't been able to help her overcome the social rejection that had consumed her world. Her case represented one of my greatest professional failures. But now, her file was appearing on my desk repeatedly, always positioned next to records of current students facing similar bullying situations. It seemed too coincidental to be random filing cabinet malfunction. The supernatural explanation occurred to me gradually, though I resisted accepting it initially. As someone trained in psychology and rational problem solving, I preferred logical explanations over paranormal theories, but the evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. The breakthrough came during a particularly disturbing morning in late October. I arrived at my office to find not just scattered files, but photocopies of confidential counseling notes scattered throughout the hallway outside my door. Someone, or something, had been attempting to distribute private student information to the broader school community. The photocopied pages contained excerpts from counseling sessions with 3 current students who were experiencing social isolation similar to what Yuki had faced. The copies highlighted specific passages about family problems, personal struggles, and emotional vulnerabilities that these students had shared in confidence. I quickly gathered all the scattered copies before any teachers or students could see them, but the incident revealed a terrifying pattern. Someone was trying to expose confidential student information, possibly believing that transparency would generate sympathy and understanding for struggling students. That evening, I decided to stay late and monitor my office directly. I needed to discover who was accessing my files and attempting to distribute confidential information. The safety of my current students depended on maintaining the privacy that allows them to seek help without fear of exposure. I positioned myself in an adjacent empty classroom with a clear view of my office door and waited. The building grew quiet as evening activities ended and staff members left for the day. By 9 p.m., I was alone in the administrative wing. Around 10:30 p.m., I saw a faint light emanating from under my office door. Someone was definitely inside, though I hadn't seen anyone enter. I approached quietly and listened at the door, hearing the soft sounds of papers being shuffled and filing cabinet drawers opening and closing. When I unlocked the door and entered my office, I found Yuki sitting at my desk. She looked exactly as she had during our counseling sessions 2 years earlier, wearing the same worn school uniform, her hair in the same neat ponytail, her expression showing the same mixture of determination and desperation I remembered from our final meeting. But her appearance had a translucent quality, like looking at someone through frosted glass. Yuki looked up from the student files she'd been organizing and smiled sadly. "Nakamura-sensei, I'm sorry for making such a mess with your files. I'm trying to help the students who are struggling like I did." My counselor training kicked in, despite the supernatural circumstances. "Yuki, what are you trying to accomplish by organizing these files?" "I want people to understand," she said, gesturing to the scattered counseling records. "When students are struggling, they suffer in silence because everyone assumes they're just weak or lazy. If teachers and other students could see their counseling files, they'd realize these students need support, not judgment." I understood her motivation, but I also recognized the dangerous flaw in her logic. Yuki, sharing confidential counseling information would destroy the trust that allows students to seek help in the first place. They come to me because they know their problems will remain private. Her expression became confused and frustrated. But privacy is what kept me isolated. Nobody knew about my family's financial problems or how hard I was trying to keep up. If they'd understood my situation, maybe they would have been more supportive instead of making everything worse. Privacy protected you from having your personal struggles become gossip or ammunition for more bullying, I explained gently. The problem wasn't confidentiality. It was the bullying culture itself. Yuki's translucent form flickered with agitation. "Then how do we help students who are suffering the same way I did? How do we make people understand that struggling students aren't weak? They're overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control." I realized that Yuki's spirit was trapped by the same misunderstanding that had tormented her in life. She believed her isolation had resulted from people not knowing her circumstances, when the real problem was a school culture that punished vulnerability and difference. We help by creating safe spaces where students can share their struggles voluntarily, I said. We educate about empathy and understanding without violating anyone's privacy. We change the culture that causes isolation, not expose the victims of that culture. Yuki listened thoughtfully, but her expression remained troubled. "I see students in your files facing the same problems I faced. I want to prevent them from ending up like me." "Your desire to help is admirable," I told her, "but exposing their private struggles would likely make their situations worse, not better. They need support, not exposure." For several minutes, we discussed different approaches to helping isolated students. Yuki's insights were valuable. She understood the psychological experience of academic bullying better than most living people. But her proposed solutions consistently involved breaking confidentiality to generate sympathy for struggling students. I realized that Yuki's spirit was caught in a loop of trying to solve her own past trauma through actions that would recreate similar trauma for current students. Her good intentions couldn't overcome the fundamental misunderstanding that had contributed to her original despair. "Yuki," I said finally, "I promise to advocate more strongly for students facing the kind of bullying you experienced. I'll work with teachers and administrators to create better support systems, but I need you to stop accessing confidential files and attempting to distribute private information." She looked conflicted, torn between her desire to help and her growing understanding that her methods were flawed. "What if I just organize the files to help you identify students who need extra attention? No copying, no distribution, just making sure their cases don't get overlooked." It was a reasonable compromise. Yuki's spiritual perspective might actually help me recognize patterns or warning signs I'd missed in my living assessment of student needs. "That would be helpful," I agreed, "but only if you promise never to remove files from the cabinet or share information with anyone else." She nodded solemnly. "I just want to prevent other students from feeling as alone as I did." Over the following weeks, I developed an unusual but effective working relationship with Yuki's spirit. Each morning, I'd find certain student files positioned prominently in my cabinet, not scattered on my desk, but organized to draw my attention to cases that might need immediate intervention. Yuki's supernatural insights proved remarkably accurate. She highlighted students whose situations were deteriorating faster than I'd realized, helping me prioritize crisis intervention for those most at risk of following her tragic path. But the arrangement wasn't without complications. Sometimes I'd arrive to find Yuki's ghostly presence still in my office, and she'd want to discuss specific student cases or share observations about school social dynamics. While her insights were valuable, these supernatural consultations were emotionally draining and ethically complex. I also had to be careful not to let other staff members discover my spectral counseling assistant. Explaining that I was receiving case management advice from a deceased student would have ended my career and damaged my credibility with the students who depended on my support. The most challenging aspect was helping Yuki understand the limitations of her posthumous advocacy. She remained convinced that transparency would solve bullying problems, requiring constant reminders about the importance of confidentiality and voluntary disclosure. During one particularly difficult conversation in late November, Yuki expressed frustration about the slow pace of culture change at our school. "Students are still suffering the same way I did," she said. "How long does it take to make people more understanding?" "Cultural change takes time," I explained, "but your help has already made a difference." 3 students whose cases you highlighted received intervention that prevented their situations from escalating. That seemed to provide some comfort to her restless spirit. Over time, her appearances became less frequent, though I still occasionally find files arranged in ways that suggest her continued involvement in student advocacy. I've learned to appreciate Yuki's unique perspective while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Her supernatural insights complement my traditional counseling training, creating a more comprehensive approach to identifying and supporting struggling students. But I'm also constantly aware of the ethical complexity of my situation. I'm essentially collaborating with a deceased student to protect living students, using information obtained through supernatural means to guide professional interventions. Sometimes I wonder if Yuki will ever find peace, or if her commitment to helping struggling students will keep her spirit bound to the school indefinitely. Part of me hopes she stays. Her insights have genuinely improved my ability to help students facing the kind of isolation that killed her. But another part of me wishes she could finally rest, knowing that her advocacy continues through the living professionals she's helped educate about student trauma. The files still get organized in my cabinet. Subtle suggestions from beyond about which students need extra attention. It's an unusual counseling partnership, but it's helped me become more effective at preventing the kind of tragedy that took Yuki's life. I just hope that someday she'll trust the living world enough to let us carry on her advocacy work without her direct supernatural intervention. The last train platform. My name is Watanabe Emi, and I'm a second-year student at Tokyo University. What I'm about to tell you happened during my first year, in the winter of 2023, when I was attending evening cram school. Even now, I avoid taking the last train whenever possible, and I never wait alone on Platform 7 at Shibuya Station after 11 p.m. Despite being accepted to Todai, I felt constant anxiety about maintaining my grades. This led me to enroll in additional English conversation classes at a private juku in Harajuku that ended at 11 p.m. I had to catch the last express train on the Yamanote line to get home to my family's apartment in Ikebukuro. The last train departed Shibuya at 11:47 p.m. sharp. Missing it would mean expensive taxi fare or sleeping in a manga cafe until morning. Platform 7 becomes lonely after 11:30 p.m. Late at night, only a handful of people wait for the final departure. exhausted workers and students like me rushing home from evening study sessions. The first time I noticed something unusual was in early February. I was waiting for the 11:47 express, reviewing vocabulary flashcards. The platform was nearly empty except for a sleeping salaryman and an elderly woman with shopping bags. At 11:45, I noticed another student standing near the platform edge, about 20 meters away. He was wearing the dark uniform of a Ronin student, someone who had failed university entrance exams and was spending a gap year studying for retakes. His posture was tense, and he kept checking what looked like an old flip phone. When the train arrived, something strange happened. The student ran toward the train doors, but instead of boarding normally, he seemed to hesitate at the threshold. He stepped forward, then backward, then forward again, as if he couldn't decide whether to get on. His movements had a frantic, desperate quality. The train conductor announced the usual doors closing warning, but the student was still standing half in, half out of the car. Other passengers began pushing past him impatiently. The delay stretched longer than normal. Usually the last train maintains a tight schedule. But this evening, we sat at the platform for nearly 3 extra minutes, while the student seemed to struggle with boarding. Finally, he stepped back onto the platform entirely, and the train departed. I watched him through the window as we pulled away. He was staring at the departing train with an expression of absolute despair. His hands pressed against his head as if he was in physical pain. The following week, I saw him again in exactly the same spot. Same uniform, same nervous energy, same desperate attempt to board the 11:47 express. Again, the train was delayed while he stood in the doorway, unable to commit to entering or leaving. This pattern continued every Tuesday evening. The Ronin student would appear on platform 7, wait anxiously for the last train, then struggle desperately to board before ultimately stepping back onto the platform. Each time, the train departure was delayed by several minutes. Other regular commuters began to notice the disruptions, but I began to suspect something more disturbing was happening. The student's appearance never changed. Same clothes, same desperate expression, same vintage flip phone that seemed out of place in 2023. During my fourth encounter in March, I positioned myself closer to where he typically stood. When the train arrived, I watched his face as he attempted to board. His expression wasn't indecisive, it was anguished. He was trying desperately to get on the train, but something was preventing him. His lips were moving as if he was speaking, and he kept checking his flip phone and looking at what appeared to be an exam admission ticket clutched in his other hand. That's when I realized he wasn't just any Ronin student. He was trying to get to an entrance exam. The old flip phone, the vintage-style admission ticket, the desperate urgency he was rushing to take university entrance exams, but something was stopping him. During a particularly disturbing incident in late March, I could see that other passengers were having difficulty getting around him. Not because he was physically blocking them, but because they seemed to slow down and become confused when they got near him. One businessman approached the same car door, then suddenly stopped and looked around with obvious disorientation. He walked to a different car entirely, as if he'd forgotten where he meant to go. The student's presence was somehow affecting other passengers' ability to board the train normally. After the train departed and the Ronin student was left alone on the platform, I approached him. He was still staring at the tunnel where the train had disappeared, his expression devastated. "Excuse me," I said politely. "Are you having trouble getting to your destination?" He turned toward me, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. He appeared to be about 20 years old, with pale complexion and tired eyes typical of students under extreme academic pressure. But there was something insubstantial about his appearance, as if he was slightly out of focus. "I have to get to Waseda University," he said, his voice barely audible. "My entrance exam is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If I miss this train, I won't have time to get there." I checked my phone. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday evening in late March 2023. University entrance exams had been completed weeks earlier. "What year is your exam?" I asked gently. He looked confused. 2019. March 15th, 2019. "I've already failed twice. This is my final chance. If I don't pass this time, my parents will disown me." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a living student. This was the spirit of someone who had died trying to reach his entrance exam. He was trapped in a loop, eternally attempting to board trains that could never take him to a test he would never take. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ishikawa Takeshi," he replied. "I'm a Ronin student from Saitama. This is my third attempt at the Waseda entrance exam. I have to succeed this time. What happened when you tried to get to your exam before?" His expression became even more anguished. "I keep missing the train. Every night I come here to catch the last express, but I can't make myself get on. I know that once I board, I'll have to face the exam results, and I'm terrified of failing again. But if I don't go, I'll definitely fail. I'm trapped." The tragic logic was devastating. Takeshi had died probably by suicide, while caught between the terror of potential failure and the impossibility of avoiding his exam. His spirit was now trapped in that same psychological paralysis, eternally unable to board trains that might take him to face his academic fate. "Takeshi," I said carefully, "what if the exam results weren't as important as you think?" He looked at me with desperate hope. "My parents sacrificed everything for my education. My father works double shifts, and my mother gave up her career to support my studies. If I fail again, I'll have wasted their entire lives." I recognize the crushing weight of family expectations that drives many Japanese students beyond their psychological limits. "Your worth as a person isn't determined by your exam scores," I told him. "Your parents love you regardless of which university you attend." For a moment, his expression softened. But then the desperate anxiety returned. "But I have to try. I have to get on that train and go to my exam." Over the following weeks, I tried various approaches to help him find peace. I brought information about alternative career paths, shared stories of successful people who had failed entrance exams initially, even brought Buddhist prayers written by my grandmother. But nothing worked. Every Tuesday night, Takeshi appeared on the platform, clutching his admission ticket and checking his old flip phone, desperately trying to board the 11:47 express to an exam 4 years in the past. The most disturbing aspect was how his presence continued to affect other passengers. The supernatural delays grew longer, and more commuters began experiencing confusion when trying to board the last train. Some people missed their rides entirely, while others boarded trains going in the wrong direction. During one severe incident in April, the 11:47 was delayed for nearly 10 minutes, while Takeshi struggled with boarding. Multiple passengers became confused and disoriented, with some apparently forgetting their destinations entirely. I realized that Takeshi's psychological trauma was somehow spreading to other people, creating a field of academic anxiety that affected anyone who got too close to him. I consulted with a Buddhist priest, describing it as hypothetical. He explained that spirits trapped by extreme psychological pressure sometimes create contamination fields that affect living people around them. Academic failure trauma is particularly persistent, he said. The shame associated with educational failure can bind a spirit more strongly than physical attachments. I began meeting Takeshi regularly to discuss his fears about academic failure. Every Tuesday after the last train departed, we would sit on the empty platform and talk about the pressure he felt from his family and society. Gradually, Takeshi shared more details about his academic struggles. He had been a mediocre student who worked incredibly hard to compensate for his lack of natural ability. His parents' sacrifices had created enormous guilt whenever he struggled with studies. "I keep thinking about my father's face when I told him I'd failed the exam again," he said during one conversation. He didn't say anything, but I could see how heartbroken he was. I couldn't bear to see that expression one more time. Takeshi's spiritual trap wasn't just about academic failure. It was about the impossible burden of carrying his entire family's dreams and sacrifices. My conversations with Takeshi continued throughout the spring semester, but I never succeeded in helping him find peace. His nightly appearances on Platform 7 persisted, along with the supernatural delays and passenger confusion. Eventually, I changed my schedule to avoid the last train entirely, taking earlier transportation even though it meant cutting my cram school sessions short. The psychological toll of witnessing Takeshi's eternal academic torment was affecting my own studies and mental health. But I still think about him often, especially during exam periods when academic pressure peaks. His story serves as a reminder of how cultural expectations around educational achievement can become so intense that they persist even beyond death. I graduated from university successfully, but I never forgot the lesson of Platform 7. Academic achievement is important, but it should never become more valuable than the psychological well-being of the people pursuing it. Takeshi is probably still there, waiting for the 11:47 express to take him to an exam he'll never reach. His tragedy serves as a warning about what happens when educational pressure becomes more powerful than the instinct for survival itself. The Club Activity Room. My name is Tanaka Mei, and I was president of the drama club at Keio High School during my third year in 2023. What I'm about to share happened during our preparation for the Spring Cultural Festival, and it changed not only how I understand theater, but how I see the invisible pressures that can destroy sensitive students. Even now, 8 months later, I can't watch emotional monologues without remembering the ghost who taught us about the deadly cost of social rejection. Our drama club met in room 3A on the 4th floor of the Arts Building, a space we'd claimed for rehearsals since I joined as a first-year student. The room was perfect for our needs, large enough for blocking scenes, with good acoustics and storage space for costumes and props. Most importantly, it was isolated from the main academic buildings, allowing us to practice without disturbing classes or attracting unwanted attention from students who might mock our theatrical pursuits. Japanese high schools often treat drama clubs as less prestigious than academic or athletic activities. While baseball and soccer teams receive respect and resources, drama students face subtle discrimination for choosing feminine artistic pursuits over traditionally masculine activities. Our male members, especially, dealt with constant teasing about their involvement in theater. During my second year, we had a particularly talented male actor named Yamamoto Akira, who joined the club despite significant social pressure. Akira was naturally gifted at emotional scenes, with an intuitive understanding of character psychology that made his performances remarkably authentic. But his sensitivity and artistic interests made him a target for bullying from other male students who viewed theater as inappropriate for boys. The harassment escalated throughout the year. Other students would make crude jokes about male actors, question Akira's masculinity, and deliberately disrupt our rehearsals with loud comments from the hallway. Akira tried to ignore the bullying, but I could see it wearing on him emotionally. His performances became more intense and desperate, as if he was channeling his real pain into his acting. During our preparation for the Winter Cultural Festival, Akira was cast as the lead in an original play I'd written about a lonely student who felt disconnected from his peers. The role seemed perfect for him. He understood the character's isolation on a personal level that elevated his performance beyond typical high school acting. But the bullying reached a breaking point during our final rehearsal week in December of 2022. A group of male students had been deliberately timing their visits to the Arts Building to coincide with our practices, making loud comments about feminine boys and fake actors that could be heard clearly through our rehearsal room walls. After one particularly brutal session of harassment, Akira approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mei-chan, I don't know if I can continue with the performance. Every day they make me feel like there's something wrong with wanting to do theater. Maybe they're right. I tried to encourage him, explaining that their behavior reflected their own insecurities rather than any problem with his artistic interests. But I could see that the constant rejection was destroying his confidence and sense of self-worth. The tragedy occurred 3 days before our scheduled performance. I arrived at school on a Monday morning to find police cars and ambulances surrounding the arts building. Akira had been discovered in room 3A over the weekend, having taken his own life by hanging. According to the investigation, he had written a final monologue, an extension of his character's speech about isolation and social rejection, and left it on our rehearsal stage before ending his life. The school administration canceled our cultural festival performance and temporarily closed the arts building. Akira's death sent shockwaves through our school community, forcing uncomfortable conversations about bullying and the pressure on male students to conform to narrow definitions of masculinity. Our drama club suspended activities for the remainder of the school year. When we finally returned to room 3A the following September, everything had been cleaned and rearranged, but the emotional weight of what had happened there remained overwhelming. I was elected club president for my final year, partly because other members felt too uncomfortable continuing their leadership roles after Akira's death. My first responsibility was helping our club heal while honoring his memory appropriately. But room 3A felt different when we resumed rehearsals. The space that had once been our creative sanctuary now carried an oppressive atmosphere that made concentration difficult. During our first few meetings, several members complained about feeling watched or judged, as if invisible eyes were evaluating their performances. The supernatural manifestations began in October, about a month after we'd resumed regular activities. During an evening rehearsal of scenes from Romeo and Juliet, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, a figure standing in the corner of the room where we typically stored unused props. When I turned to look directly, no one was there. But several other members mentioned seeing the same thing throughout the rehearsal. "There's someone watching us from the storage area," said Hashimoto, our second-year lighting coordinator. "I keep seeing him, but when I look over, he disappears." The sightings became more frequent over the following weeks. Always in peripheral vision, always in the storage corner, always during our most emotionally intense rehearsal scenes. The figure appeared to be a male student wearing our school uniform, but none of us could make out clear facial features. During a particularly emotional scene from Glass Menagerie in late October, the supernatural presence became impossible to ignore. As our lead actress delivered Laura's monologue about feeling different and isolated, I heard a voice speaking along with her, not echoing her words, but delivering a completely different monologue in a familiar male voice. It was Akira's voice, speaking the final monologue he'd written before taking his own life. "I stand on the stage of my own isolation," his ghostly voice said, audible to everyone in the room. "Every day, I perform the role of normal student, hiding my true interests and feelings behind a mask of acceptability. But the audience, my classmates, my teachers, society itself, sees through the performance. They know I'm different, and they reject me for it." Our rehearsal stopped as everyone stared at the storage corner, where Akira's translucent figure had materialized. He was wearing his school uniform, but his appearance had the pale, hollow quality of someone who had died in despair. His expression held the same desperate sadness I remembered from his final weeks alive. "The worst part," his monologue continued, "is that I began to believe their judgment. I started to think there really was something wrong with being sensitive, with loving theater, with expressing emotions that boys aren't supposed to feel. I let their hatred become self-hatred." Several club members began crying as Akira's words filled the rehearsal room. His ghostly performance was heartbreakingly authentic, conveying the emotional isolation that had led to his death with devastating clarity. "I wrote this monologue for a character," he said, looking directly at me. But I realize now that I was writing about myself. The lonely student wasn't fiction, it was autobiography. When his speech ended, Akira's ghost faded away, leaving us in stunned silence. But his presence had fundamentally changed the atmosphere in room 3A. Instead of feeling oppressive, the space now felt heavy with unresolved grief and the urgent need for understanding. Over the following weeks, Akira's ghost appeared regularly during our rehearsals, always delivering the same monologue about isolation and social rejection. But rather than being frightening, his presence became a powerful reminder of why our theatrical work mattered. His performances forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our school's culture and the pressure faced by students who didn't conform to traditional gender expectations. Several male club members shared their own experiences with harassment for participating in drama, acknowledging fears they'd never voiced before. Watching Akira's ghost perform that monologue makes me realize how close I came to giving up theater myself, said Takeshi, a second-year actor who'd faced similar bullying. The difference is that I had this club as a support system. He felt completely alone. I began incorporating Akira's themes into our planned spring performance, creating a play that addressed bullying, social conformity, and the importance of accepting diverse forms of masculinity. His ghostly monologue became inspiration for characters who struggled with similar issues but found ways to overcome social rejection. But Akira's supernatural presence also created practical challenges. His appearances during rehearsals were emotionally overwhelming for some members, particularly younger students who hadn't known him personally. Several first years requested transfers to other clubs, saying the atmosphere in room 3A was too intense for comfortable participation. I consulted with our school's Buddhist chaplain about the situation, explaining that we were dealing with a troubled spirit who seemed bound to our rehearsal space. The chaplain performed a memorial service in room 3A, offering prayers for Akira's peaceful transition while acknowledging his continued connection to the dramatic arts he'd loved. The ceremony didn't banish Akira's ghost, but it seemed to bring him some peace. His appearances became less frequent and more focused, typically occurring during scenes that directly related to his themes of isolation and social acceptance. During our spring cultural festival performance, a play I'd written called Masks We Wear, Akira's Ghost, appeared one final time. As our lead actor delivered a monologue about finding the courage to be authentic despite social pressure, I saw Akira standing at the back of the audience, watching with an expression of pride and satisfaction. After that performance, which received positive reviews and sparked important conversations about bullying in our school community, Akira's appearances became rare. Occasionally, during particularly emotional rehearsals, sensitive club members would sense his presence or catch glimpses of him in peripheral vision, but he no longer delivered his desperate monologue about isolation. I graduated and went on to study theater at university, but I never forgot the lessons Akira's ghost taught our drama club. His supernatural presence forced us to confront the toxic aspects of our school culture, while inspiring us to create art that addressed real social problems. Our drama club established an annual memorial performance in Akira's honor, featuring plays that explore themes of acceptance, diversity, and the importance of supporting students who feel different or isolated. Room 3A now has a small shrine where current members can offer prayers for students struggling with social rejection. Sometimes I wonder if Akira's spirit found the peace he sought, or if he continues watching over drama students who face the same pressures that destroyed him. Part of me hopes he's still there, offering invisible support to sensitive young actors who need reminding that their artistic gifts are valuable, despite social disapproval. The ghost in room 3A taught us that theater can be more than entertainment. It can be a form of social healing that addresses the wounds inflicted by intolerance and conformity. Akira's death was a tragedy, but his supernatural legacy helped create positive change in our school community. His final monologue about isolation became a call to action for acceptance and understanding. Even in death, he was still performing, still teaching, still trying to prevent other sensitive students from experiencing the devastating loneliness that had cost him his life. The nurse's office bed. My name is Ogawa Yukiko, and I've been a school nurse at Shirane Girls High School for 8 years. What I'm about to share happened during the spring semester of 2023, and it fundamentally changed how I understand the connection between academic pressure and physical illness. Even now, 9 months later, I carefully monitor which students use the recovery bed in my office, and I can never shake the feeling that some forms of trauma can literally infect others. Shirane Girls High is a prestigious preparatory school in Tokyo, known for its rigorous academic standards and high university acceptance rates. Our students face enormous pressure to maintain perfect grades while preparing for entrance exams that will determine their entire future. As the school nurse, I see the physical manifestations of this stress: daily headaches, stomach problems, fatigue, and various psychosomatic symptoms that reflect the psychological toll of academic competition. My office is located on the first floor of the main building, a small but well-equipped space with examination areas, medical supplies, and 2 recovery beds where students can rest when they feel unwell. The beds are separated by a privacy curtain, allowing me to care for multiple students simultaneously while maintaining appropriate boundaries. During the spring semester, I noticed a troubling increase in students seeking medical attention for symptoms that seemed disproportionate to their apparent physical condition. Previously healthy students would arrive complaining of severe stomach pain, dizziness, and weakness that had no obvious medical cause. Blood tests and basic examinations revealed nothing abnormal, but the students' distress was clearly genuine. The pattern was particularly concerning because it affected our most academically driven students, those who maintained perfect attendance, participated in multiple extracurricular activities, and placed enormous pressure on themselves to succeed. These were students who typically avoided the nurse's office entirely, viewing any absence from class as failure. One student who exemplified this trend was Matsumoto Yuki, a third-year student preparing for university entrance exams. Yuki had been one of our top performers academically, but during her final semester, she began visiting my office almost daily with complaints of stomach pain and nausea that prevented her from eating properly. Yuki's physical symptoms were accompanied by obvious weight loss and signs of nutritional deficiency, but when I suggested she see a specialist for eating disorder evaluation, she became defensive and insisted her problems were purely medical. "I'm just stressed about exams," she would say. "Once university applications are submitted, I'll be fine." But Yuki's condition continued to deteriorate. She would spend hours lying on the recovery bed in my office, too weak to return to class but unable to rest peacefully. During these sessions, I noticed she often spoke to herself in whispers, as if carrying on conversations with someone I couldn't see. The situation reached a crisis point in early April when Yuki collapsed during a practice exam and was hospitalized for severe malnutrition. Her parents were shocked to discover that their academically successful daughter had been secretly struggling with an eating disorder that had progressed to life-threatening levels. According to her medical team, Yuki had been restricting her food intake for months, believing that physical discomfort would help her maintain focus during study sessions. The pressure to achieve perfect scores had convinced her that any pleasure, including satisfying meals, was a distraction from her academic goals. Yuki died in the hospital 3 weeks later from complications related to her eating disorder. Her death devastated our school community and forced uncomfortable conversations about the relationship between academic pressure and student mental health. But the tragedy didn't end with Yuki's death. In the weeks following her funeral, I noticed that other students were developing similar symptoms to those Yuki had experienced. Previously healthy students would arrive at my office complaining of stomach pain, nausea, and weakness that seemed to have no medical cause. More disturbing was that many of these students specifically requested to use the same recovery bed where Yuki had spent so many hours during her final months. They would lie in that exact spot, often assuming the same position Yuki had favored, and report feeling slightly better after resting there. But better was a relative term. While the bed seemed to provide temporary relief from their symptoms, the students who used it began showing concerning changes in their eating habits and relationship with food. Several developed restrictive eating patterns, similar to those that had characterized Yuki's disorder. During a particularly disturbing incident in late April, I found Suzuki Mana, a normally healthy second-year student, lying on Yuki's former bed and whispering to herself in the same manner Yuki had exhibited. When I approached to check on her condition, Mana looked at me with an expression of desperate hunger, combined with self-denial that I recognized from Yuki's final weeks. "I can't eat anything," Mana said, her voice weak but determined. "She's telling me that food will make me too comfortable, too satisfied to study properly." Academic success requires sacrifice, including the sacrifice of physical pleasure. The pronouns in Mana's statement chilled me. She was clearly referring to someone else, someone who was influencing her thoughts about food and academic performance. That evening, I stayed late at school to observe the recovery bed more carefully. If Yuki's spirit was somehow affecting other students, I needed to understand what was happening and how to protect the living students under my care. Around 9 p.m., when the building was mostly empty, I saw her. Yuki was lying on the recovery bed, in the same position she had favored during her final weeks, curled on her side, knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped around her stomach, as if trying to contain physical pain. Her appearance was exactly as I remembered, but with the pale, translucent quality of someone who had died from prolonged suffering. She looked at me with the same mixture of determination and desperation that had characterized her final visits to my office. "Ogawa-sensei," she said, her voice barely audible, "I finally understand what it takes to succeed academically. Complete dedication means eliminating all distractions, including physical comfort." "Yuki, that kind of thinking is what made you sick," I replied gently. "Academic success shouldn't require destroying your health." Her expression became confused and frustrated. But look how focused I became when I stopped eating regularly. My mind was completely clear, completely dedicated to studying. Other students can learn from my experience. I realized that Yuki's spirit was trapped by the same distorted thinking that had killed her. She believed her eating disorder had been a form of academic discipline rather than a mental illness, and she was trying to share this wisdom with other vulnerable students. "Yuki, you died from malnutrition. Your restrictive eating wasn't helpful, it was harmful. But the mental clarity," she insisted, "the complete focus on academic goals without the distraction of physical pleasure. I can help other students achieve that same dedication." Over the following weeks, I documented the pattern of supernatural influence affecting students who used Yuki's former recovery bed. They would arrive with stress-related symptoms, rest on the bed, and leave with subtle but concerning changes in their attitudes toward food and physical comfort. The students most susceptible to Yuki's influence were those already struggling with academic pressure and perfectionist tendencies. Her spirit seemed to target students whose psychological profiles matched her own, sharing her distorted beliefs about the relationship between physical deprivation and academic achievement. I consulted with the school's Buddhist chaplain about the situation, explaining that we appeared to be dealing with a spirit whose mental illness had persisted beyond death. The chaplain performed a purification ritual in my office, but warned that spirits trapped by psychological disorders were particularly difficult to help. "When mental illness shapes someone's entire worldview," he explained, "death doesn't necessarily provide clarity about their distorted thinking. The spirit may continue to believe their harmful behaviors were beneficial." I decided to try a different approach. Instead of attempting to banish Yuki's spirit, I began having regular conversations with her about the nature of academic success and physical health. Every evening after school, I would sit beside the recovery bed and discuss alternative perspectives on student achievement. Gradually, Yuki began to question some of her beliefs about food restriction and academic performance. Our conversations revealed that her eating disorder had developed from a combination of family pressure, social perfectionism, and misguided attempts to control her environment through physical self-denial. I thought that if I could master my physical needs, she said during one conversation, I would prove I was strong enough to master any academic challenge. But looking back, I realize I was just making myself weaker. These discussions seemed to reduce Yuki's influence over other students. While her spirit remained present in my office, she stopped actively encouraging restrictive eating behaviors in vulnerable students who used the recovery bed. But the supernatural situation remained complex. Some students still reported feeling Yuki's presence and occasionally receiving her thoughts about academic pressure and physical discomfort. Her spirit seemed to serve as a reservoir of academic trauma that could affect students who were psychologically similar to her. I implemented new protocols for my office, including careful monitoring of students who used the recovery bed and immediate intervention if anyone showed signs of developing eating disorder symptoms. I also arranged for the school counseling department to provide additional support for students struggling with academic pressure. The recovery bed still carries traces of Yuki's presence. Sensitive students sometimes report feeling understood when they rest there, as if someone shares their academic fears and physical discomfort. But now I'm equipped to recognize when that understanding becomes harmful and to intervene before supernatural influence can develop into dangerous behavioral changes. Yuki's case taught me that some forms of mental illness can persist beyond death, continuing to affect vulnerable individuals who share similar psychological struggles. Her spirit serves as a reminder that academic pressure can literally be deadly when combined with pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities. I continue my evening conversations with Yuki, helping her understand the difference between healthy academic dedication and self-destructive perfectionism. She's made progress in recognizing that her eating disorder was an illness rather than an academic strategy, but her recovery, even in death, remains ongoing. The nurse's office bed remains in use, but now it's carefully supervised. Yuki's presence has become a teaching tool rather than a source of contagion, helping me identify students at risk for developing similar disorders while providing insight into the psychological mechanics of academic trauma. Sometimes I wonder if other schools have similar spirits, students whose academic struggles persisted beyond death, influencing new generations of vulnerable young people. The thought makes me more vigilant about the connection between supernatural phenomena and mental health, and more committed to protecting living students from both forms of harm. The broken elevator. My name is Tanaka Hiroshi, and I've been the head janitor at Sakura Municipal High School for 15 years. What I'm about to tell you happened during the winter semester of 2023, and it changed my understanding of both mechanical failure and spiritual persistence. Even now, 10 months later, I avoid the third floor after dark, and I can never hear elevator machinery without remembering the ghost who taught me that some emergencies never end. Sakura Municipal High is a 4-story concrete building constructed in the 1980s, designed to serve students from working-class families in our district. The school's elevator was installed to comply with accessibility requirements, primarily serving students with mobility challenges and staff moving heavy equipment between floors. In March of 2021, during a fire drill evacuation, the elevator malfunctioned catastrophically. A second-year student named Watanabe Kentaro, who used a wheelchair due to cerebral palsy, was trapped inside when the system failed during the emergency procedure. The elevator stopped between the second and third floors, and despite rescue efforts, Kentaro died from smoke inhalation when a small electrical fire broke out in the shaft. The tragedy led to multiple investigations, lawsuits, and safety protocol changes. The elevator was permanently shut down, with the school board citing budget constraints that prevented expensive repairs. For 2 years, the elevator doors remained sealed with yellow caution tape, serving as a reminder of institutional failure and a young life lost to inadequate safety measures. As head janitor, I was responsible for the overall maintenance and security of the building. My duties included evening rounds to ensure all systems were functioning properly and the facility was secure for the next school day. These rounds typically took me through all 4 floors, including the areas around the sealed elevator. During my evening inspections in January of 2023, I began noticing irregularities around the elevator shaft. Despite being officially inoperative, the elevator indicator lights would occasionally flicker during my late-night rounds. I also heard mechanical sounds, the whir of motors, and the grinding of cables coming from inside the sealed shaft. Initially, I assumed these phenomena were related to residual electrical activity or mechanical settling in the abandoned system. Old buildings often produce strange sounds, and electrical systems can maintain phantom activity long after being disconnected. But the sounds followed consistent patterns that seemed too regular for random mechanical failure. The noises always occurred around the same time between 2 and 3 a.m. and followed a specific sequence. I would hear the elevator motor engage, the sound of cables moving, then a prolonged grinding noise, as if the car was struggling to move between floors. The sequence would repeat several times before stopping abruptly. During a particularly clear night in early February, I decided to investigate the sounds more thoroughly. I positioned myself near the sealed elevator doors on the second floor and waited for the usual mechanical activity to begin. At 2:15 a.m., I heard the elevator motor start up inside the shaft. But instead of remaining sealed, the doors in front of me began to open slowly, revealing the elevator car's interior lit by flickering emergency lighting. Inside the car, I saw Kentaro. He was sitting in his wheelchair in the same position I remembered from when he was alive, slightly hunched forward, his hands gripping the armrests with obvious tension. His school uniform was exactly as it had been during the fire drill, but his appearance had the pale, desperate quality of someone trapped in their final, terrifying moments. The elevator car was filled with a hazy smoke that seemed to come from nowhere, and Kentaro was repeatedly pressing the elevator buttons with increasing desperation. His movements were frantic but futile. No matter which buttons he pressed, the car remained stationary between floors. "Help me," he said, his voice barely audible over the mechanical grinding. "The fire alarm is going off, but I can't get to the evacuation area. The elevator won't move." I realized I was witnessing Kentaro's final moments, trapped in a malfunctioning elevator during the emergency that had killed him. His spirit was reliving the trauma of being unable to escape, eternally pressing buttons that would never bring him to safety. "Kentaro," I said gently, "the fire drill is over. You don't need to evacuate anymore." He looked at me with confusion and mounting panic. "But I can hear the alarm. I can smell smoke. I have to get to the designated evacuation area. But this elevator won't work." "Why won't it work?" The elevator doors closed suddenly, cutting off our conversation. I heard the motor grinding for several more minutes before the sound stopped entirely, leaving the hallway in complete silence. Over the following weeks, I documented a pattern of supernatural elevator activity. Every night between 2 and 3 a.m., Kentaro's ghost would attempt to use the elevator to reach the evacuation area, repeating the same desperate sequence of button pressing and calling for help. But the situation became more dangerous when living students began encountering the phantom elevator during late-night school activities. Drama club members staying for evening rehearsals, sports teams finishing late practices, and students attending night classes started reporting strange elevator experiences. The first serious incident occurred in mid-February, when Suzuki Yuma, a third-year student, was trapped in the elevator for over an hour during what he described as a phantom ride. According to Yuma's account, he had called the elevator from the third floor, not realizing it was supposed to be inoperative. The doors opened normally, Yuma told me the next day, and I got in without thinking about it. But once inside, I realized there was someone else in the car, a student in a wheelchair who looked really scared. The elevator started moving, but it felt wrong, like we were going sideways or in circles instead of up or down. Yuma described being trapped with Kentaro's ghost for what felt like hours, experiencing the deceased student's panic and desperation as they tried repeatedly to reach the evacuation area. He kept pressing buttons and asking me to help him get out, but nothing I did made any difference. I felt his fear, like it was my own fear. Similar incidents began occurring regularly. Students would accidentally board the phantom elevator and find themselves trapped in Kentaro's endless evacuation attempt, experiencing his terror and helplessness, until the supernatural ride finally ended and released them on random floors. The trapped students all reported similar experiences, sharing Kentaro's desperate need to escape, feeling his physical discomfort and emotional panic, and being unable to control the elevator's movement despite pressing buttons repeatedly. Many emerged from these encounters with lasting anxiety about elevators and enclosed spaces. I consulted with the school administration about the supernatural incidents, but they were reluctant to acknowledge paranormal activity on school property. Instead, they increased security measures around the sealed elevator and threatened disciplinary action for students caught tampering with the equipment. But the phantom rides continued, and students kept getting trapped in Kentaro's traumatic loop. I realized I needed to find a way to help his spirit understand that the emergency was over and he no longer needed to evacuate. During one of my evening encounters with Kentaro's ghost, I tried a different approach. Instead of telling him the fire drill was finished, I focused on helping him process his experience of being trapped. "Kentaro," I said when the elevator doors opened, "I know you're trying to reach the evacuation area, but you're safe now. The emergency is over." "I can't be safe until I follow the evacuation procedure," he replied, his voice filled with the learned anxiety of someone who had been taught that his survival depended on following specific protocols. Students with mobility challenges have special requirements during emergencies. I have to get to the designated area. I realized that Kentaro's spirit was trapped not just by his traumatic death, but by his internalized sense of responsibility to follow emergency procedures that had ultimately failed to protect him. His conscientiousness had become a spiritual prison. "The evacuation procedures failed you," I told him gently. "The system that was supposed to keep you safe didn't work. It's not your fault that you couldn't reach the evacuation area." For the first time, Kentaro stopped pressing buttons and looked directly at me. "But if I don't follow the procedures, how can I be safe? How can anyone be safe?" I understood then that Kentaro's ghost was grappling with more than personal trauma. He was confronting the failure of institutional systems designed to protect vulnerable students. His death had revealed the inadequacy of emergency protocols, but his spirit couldn't accept that the procedures themselves were flawed. Real safety comes from having systems that actually work, I explained, not from blindly following procedures that aren't adequate. Your death wasn't caused by your failure to evacuate. It was caused by equipment failure and inadequate emergency planning. Our conversations continued over several weeks, with Kentaro gradually beginning to understand that his death reflected institutional failures rather than his personal inadequacy. But changing his spiritual understanding of the emergency didn't immediately free him from his traumatic loop. The phantom elevator rides decreased in frequency but didn't stop entirely. Kentaro's spirit seemed to be processing his trauma gradually, sometimes successfully accepting that the emergency was over, other times reverting to desperate evacuation attempts. I worked with the school's Buddhist chaplain to perform memorial services for Kentaro, honoring his memory while acknowledging the institutional failures that had led to his death. We also advocated for improved accessibility and emergency protocols to prevent similar tragedies. The school administration eventually allocated funds for a new elevator system with enhanced safety features and backup power supplies. During the installation process, workers found Kentaro's school ID card wedged in the old elevator's control panel, a tangible reminder of his final desperate attempts to escape. The phantom elevator rides became rare after the new system was installed, though sensitive students occasionally report feeling watched while using the elevator, as if someone is monitoring their safe passage between floors. I interpret this as Kentaro's spirit maintaining a protective presence rather than reliving trauma. The old elevator shaft was sealed permanently and converted into a memorial space, with a plaque honoring Kentaro's memory and acknowledging the school's commitment to improved accessibility. The memorial serves as a reminder that institutional failures have real human costs, and that safety procedures must be designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. Sometimes during my evening rounds, I still hear faint mechanical sounds from the sealed shaft, not the grinding desperation of a malfunctioning system, but the quiet hum of machinery at rest. I like to think it's Kentaro's spirit, finally at peace, no longer trapped in an endless evacuation but serving as a guardian, watching over students who depend on elevators for safe navigation of our building. His death was a tragedy that revealed systemic failures in our emergency planning, but his supernatural presence ultimately led to improvements that better protect students with disabilities. The broken elevator taught us that some emergencies never end until we address the institutional problems that create them in the first place. The Music Room Piano. My name is Yamamoto Yuki, and I was president of the piano club at Seishin Girls High School during my third year in 2023. What I'm about to share happened during the months leading up to our spring recital, and it changed not only how I understand music, but how I see the cost of sacrificing artistic passion for societal expectations. Even now, 8 months later, I can't play solo pieces without listening for a second pianist, and I can never forget the ghost who taught me that some melodies survive even death. Seishin Girls High is a prestigious preparatory school in Tokyo, known for producing students who excel in traditional academic subjects while maintaining accomplishments in cultural arts. Our music program is particularly strong, with many graduates continuing to study music at university level or maintaining artistic pursuits alongside professional careers. The piano club met in Music Room 2 on the third floor, a soundproofed space with 2 grand pianos and excellent acoustics. As club president, I had access to the room for solo practice sessions, which I used extensively to prepare for competitions and college auditions. My goal was to study music composition at Tokyo University of the Arts, continuing a passion I'd developed since childhood. During my second year, there had been another exceptional pianist in our club named Tanaka Haruto. Despite being the only male member, Haruto was extraordinarily talented, with the kind of natural musical intuition that made complex pieces seem effortless. His performances were emotionally rich and technically perfect, demonstrating the rare combination of skill and artistic sensitivity that defines truly gifted musicians. Haruto had dreamed of studying piano performance at a conservatory, but his parents insisted he focus on academic subjects that would lead to a stable professional career. His father was a surgeon who expected Haruto to follow in his footsteps, viewing music as an appropriate hobby, but not a serious career path. Throughout his second year, I watched Haruto struggle with the conflict between his musical passion and his family's expectations. He would spend hours practicing, pouring his emotional turmoil into beautiful, haunting performances. But as university entrance exam season approached, his parents pressured him to quit the piano club entirely and focus exclusively on science and mathematics. The pressure reached a breaking point during our winter concert preparation. Haruto had been selected to perform a challenging Chopin piece that perfectly showcased his abilities. But 2 weeks before the performance, his parents forced him to withdraw from the club and surrender his piano practice time to additional studying. I still remember our final conversation in Music Room 2. Haruto sat at the piano, playing fragments of melodies with tears streaming down his face. "Music is the only thing that makes sense to me," he said. "Everything else feels like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. But my parents say artistic careers are too uncertain, too selfish. They've sacrificed everything for my education, and I can't disappoint them." Haruto committed suicide 3 days later, leaving behind a note explaining that he couldn't bear to live without music, but also couldn't defy his family's expectations. His death shocked our school community and forced painful conversations about the pressure students face to choose practical careers over artistic fulfillment. After Haruto's funeral, Music Room 2 felt different. The space that had once been filled with collaborative energy now felt heavy with unresolved grief. Several club members requested transfers to other activities, saying they couldn't concentrate in the room where Haruto had spent so many hours pouring his heart into music. I became club president during my 3rd year, partly because I was one of the few members willing to continue using Music Room 2 regularly. My dedication to music had only intensified. After witnessing Haruto's tragedy, I was more determined than ever to pursue artistic education, despite the practical challenges it might present. But solo practice sessions in the room began to feel less solitary than expected. During my evening rehearsals, I often heard what sounded like a second piano playing along with my pieces. Initially, I assumed the sounds were echoes or acoustic effects from the soundproofing, but the harmonies were too perfect, too musically sophisticated to be random resonance. The phantom music began in November during my preparation for a winter competition. I was practicing Debussy's Clair de Lune when I heard complementary melodies weaving through my performance, not competing with my playing, but enhancing it with subtle harmonic support that made the piece more emotionally complex and beautiful. At first, the duet effect was barely noticeable, just an additional layer of sound that seemed to emerge naturally from the piano itself. But over several weeks of practice, the secondary melodies became more distinct and clearly intentional. Someone or something was playing along with me, creating spontaneous arrangements that demonstrated profound musical understanding. During a particularly emotional practice session in early December, I finally saw him. As I played a melancholy piece by Satie, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision and turned to see Haruto sitting at the second piano, his fingers moving gracefully over keys that made no sound when he touched them, yet somehow produced the ethereal harmonies I'd been hearing. His appearance was exactly as I remembered: neat school uniform, intense concentration, the slight forward lean he'd always maintained while playing. But his form had a translucent quality, and his expression held a sadness that went beyond normal teenage melancholy. "Haruto?" I said, stopping my own playing. He looked up from the piano with surprise, as if he hadn't realized I could see him. "Yuki-chan, I'm sorry if I'm disturbing your practice. I couldn't stop myself from playing along. Your music is so beautiful, and I miss making music with other people." "You're not disturbing me," I replied. "Your harmonies make everything more beautiful, but you're supposed to be dead," he finished matter-of-factly. "I know, but somehow I'm still here, still drawn to this piano, still needing to make music. Death didn't take away my love for playing it, just made it impossible to play for living people." Over the following weeks, Haruto and I developed an unusual musical partnership. During my solo practice sessions, he would appear and provide harmonic accompaniment that elevated my performances beyond anything I could achieve alone. His ghostly presence transformed my rehearsals into collaborative experiences that taught me new approaches to musical interpretation. But our supernatural duets came with emotional complexity. Haruto's spirit was trapped not just by death, but by the unresolved conflict between his artistic passion and his family's expectations. His music reflected this torment, weaving themes of loss, regret, and unfulfilled dreams into even the most optimistic pieces. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd been stronger," he said during one of our sessions. "If I'd defied my parents and chosen music over their approval, maybe I'd be preparing for conservatory auditions instead of this." "You weren't weak for wanting your family's support," I told him. "The tragedy is that they couldn't see how much music meant to you." His ghostly performances began affecting other club members who practiced in Music Room 2. Students would report hearing inspirational music during their solo practice, but instead of feeling encouraged, they became melancholy and introspective about their own artistic compromises. Several members started questioning their college and career plans, wondering if they were making the same mistake Haruto had made by prioritizing practical concerns over artistic passion. The supernatural influence was causing an epidemic of artistic soul-searching that worried teachers and parents. During one particularly intense duet session, Haruto's playing became more aggressive and dissonant, reflecting his growing frustration with his spiritual situation. "I can make music with you," he said, "but I can never perform for an audience again. I can never attend the conservatory I dreamed about. I can never have the career I wanted. What's the point of continuing to play?" I realized that Haruto's ghost was facing a new version of the same dilemma that had killed him, the question of whether artistic expression was meaningful without external validation or practical application. "Music doesn't need external validation to be valuable," I said. "The joy of creating something beautiful, the emotional expression, the connection with other musicians, these things matter regardless of career outcomes." But Haruto remained tormented by questions of purpose and recognition. His supernatural presence in Music Room 2 became more unpredictable, sometimes enhancing student performances and sometimes creating dissonance that reflected his internal conflict. I consulted with our school's music teacher, Sato Sensei, about the situation, describing it in hypothetical terms rather than admitting supernatural activity was occurring in our practice space. She suggested that students dealing with artistic pressure might benefit from conversations about finding balance between passion and practicality. Following her advice, I organized club discussions about career planning that acknowledged both artistic dreams and practical concerns. We talked about ways to maintain musical involvement even in non-musical careers, and strategies for pursuing artistic goals while maintaining family relationships. These discussions seemed to provide some comfort to Haruto's spirit. His musical contributions became more stable and consistently supportive, rather than erratic and emotionally turbulent. He began playing pieces that expressed hope and determination, rather than just loss and regret. During our spring recital preparation, Haruto made a final appearance that demonstrated his spiritual growth. As I practiced my featured solo, the same Chopin piece he'd been forced to abandon the previous year, he provided the most beautiful harmonic accompaniment I'd ever experienced. "Play this piece for both of us," he said after our rehearsal ended. "Show everyone what it sounds like when someone is allowed to pursue their musical dreams without having to choose between art and family approval." My recital performance was the best of my high school career, though the audience only heard my solo playing. Haruto's ghostly harmonies were audible only to me, but they inspired a level of emotional expression that moved several audience members to tears. After the recital, I never saw Haruto's ghost again. Music Room 2 returned to normal acoustic properties, with no more phantom duets or supernatural harmonies, but his influence on my musical development was permanent. I had learned to play with an emotional depth and collaborative sensitivity that wouldn't have developed without his ghostly mentorship. I was accepted to Tokyo University of the Arts, pursuing the musical education that Haruto never got to experience. But I carry his memory and his unfulfilled dreams with me, performing not just for my own artistic fulfillment, but as a tribute to students whose artistic passions were sacrificed to societal pressure. Sometimes, during solo performances, I still listen for a second pianist who might join me in creating something more beautiful than either of us could achieve alone. The Ghost in Music Room 2 taught me that artistic collaboration can transcend even death, and that the most meaningful music often comes from shared understanding of both joy and loss. Haruto's spirit found peace not through abandoning his artistic dreams, but through discovering that music could still be meaningful, even without traditional career validation. His supernatural presence became a reminder that artistic expression has value that extends beyond practical considerations, a lesson that continues to guide my musical journey. The Shoe Lockers. My name is Matsumoto Kenji, and I'm now a second-year student at Sakura Middle School. What I'm about to tell you happened during my first year, in the fall semester of 2023, when I was still adjusting to middle school life and trying to avoid becoming a target for bullying. Even now, more than a year later, I always check multiple shoe lockers when looking for my school shoes, and I can never forget the ghost who taught me that sometimes protection comes from the most unexpected places. Sakura Middle School is a typical public school in suburban Tokyo, serving students from diverse family backgrounds. The building follows the standard Japanese school layout, with outdoor shoe lockers arranged in long rows near the main entrance. Each student is assigned a specific numbered locker, where they change from their outdoor shoes to indoor slippers at the beginning of each school day. The shoe-changing routine is more than just practical. It's a daily ritual that reinforces school hierarchy and social dynamics. Popular students tend to gather near certain locker sections, while quieter or more vulnerable students quickly change their shoes and move on to avoid unwanted attention. The locker area becomes a social battleground where bullying often begins with seemingly minor incidents, like hiding shoes or damaging footwear. As a new first-year student, I was assigned locker number 73 in the middle section. I was small for my age, wore thick glasses, and had the kind of nervous personality that unfortunately attracted bullying attention. Within the first few weeks of school, older students began targeting me for minor harassment. Nothing severe enough to report, but persistent enough to make each morning stressful. The bullying typically occurred during the morning shoe change period. Second and third year students would accidentally bump into me, make comments about my appearance, or block my access to my locker until I became flustered and apologetic. It was the kind of systematic intimidation that many students face but rarely discuss with teachers or parents. The first strange incident occurred in early October, about a month into the school year. I arrived at my assigned locker to find it empty. My school shoes were nowhere to be found. After searching frantically, I discovered them in locker number 47, 3 rows away from my assigned location. Initially, I assumed it was a prank by the students who had been harassing me. Moving someone's shoes was a common bullying tactic designed to make victims late for class or force them to wear outdoor shoes inside, which would result in disciplinary action. But when I asked the older students about it, they seemed genuinely puzzled by my accusation. The shoe relocations became a regular pattern. Every few days, I would arrive at school to find my shoes had been moved to a different locker. Sometimes they were just a few numbers away from my assigned spot. Other times they appeared in completely different sections of the locker area. The move seemed random, with no obvious logic or pattern. But I began to notice something interesting about the relocations. On days when my shoes were moved, the older students who usually bothered me seemed confused or distracted. They would approach my assigned locker, find it empty, and then lose interest in harassing me because I wasn't there to intimidate. The shoe movements were actually protecting me from bullying by disrupting the predictable routine that allowed harassment to occur. During one particularly stressful morning in late October, I was searching for my relocated shoes when I noticed another first-year student, Tanaka Hiroshi, looking equally frustrated. His shoes had also been moved from their assigned location. "This keeps happening to me too," Hiroshi said quietly. "Every time those third-year students start bothering me, my shoes end up in a different locker the next day." We compared experiences and discovered that several first-year students were experiencing similar shoe relocations. All of us were targets of bullying, and all of us had noticed that the mysterious moves seemed to interfere with harassment patterns. "It's like someone is watching out for us," Hiroshi observed. "Someone who knows when we need protection." That evening, I decided to research the history of our school's bullying incidents. In the library's newspaper archives, I found a tragic story from 3 years earlier about a student named Yamada Chiaki, who had committed suicide after severe bullying that began in the shoe locker area. According to the reports, Chiaki had been systematically harassed by older students who would hide her shoes, fill them with water or dirt, or block her access to her locker. The bullying escalated over several months, with the shoe locker area becoming a daily source of terror for her. In her final weeks, Chiaki had begun using different lockers each day, trying to avoid predictable patterns that allowed bullies to target her. She would arrive early and choose random empty lockers, hoping to evade the students who made her life miserable. But the strategy couldn't protect her from the broader social isolation and psychological trauma she was experiencing. Reading about Chiaki's death made me realize who was moving our shoes. Her spirit was still trying to protect vulnerable students by disrupting the predictable routines that enabled bullying. She was using the same strategy that had briefly helped her changing locker locations to confuse harassers and provide temporary safety for victims. The next morning, I arrived at school early and spoke quietly to the shoe locker area. "Chiaki-san, if you're here, I want to thank you for helping us. I know you're trying to protect students who are going through what you experienced." I didn't see anything supernatural, but that day my shoes appeared in a locker very close to the teacher's office, where bullying rarely occurred because of adult supervision. The placement seemed intentional rather than random. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the patterns of shoe movements. Chiaki's spirit seemed to have developed a sophisticated understanding of bullying dynamics at our school. She would move shoes to locations where harassment was less likely, near teacher supervision areas, close to popular students who disapproved of bullying, or in sections where the targeted students' friends typically gathered. But Chiaki's supernatural intervention created some practical problems. Students were frequently late to class while searching for relocated shoes, and teachers began to notice the disruption. Some faculty members suspected organized pranks and threatened disciplinary action against anyone caught moving shoes without permission. During a particularly concerning incident in November, several students' shoes were moved to a single locker, creating obvious supernatural evidence that worried school administrators. The pile of mismatched footwear couldn't be explained by normal student behavior. I realized that Chiaki's protective efforts might accidentally create more problems for the students she was trying to help. If teachers interpreted the shoe movements as disruptive behavior, victims might face punishment instead of protection. That evening, I returned to school after hours and spoke to Chiaki's spirit directly. "I know you want to help us," I said to the empty locker area, "but we need to be more careful, or the teachers will think we're causing trouble ourselves." A cold breeze moved through the corridor, and I heard what sounded like quiet crying. In the dim light, I could see the faint outline of a girl in a school uniform sitting on the floor near the lockers, her knees drawn up to her chest in a posture of defensive fear. "I just want them to stop hurting people," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know what it feels like to be afraid every morning, wondering what they'll do to your shoes, whether you'll be able to get to class on time, whether anyone cares that you're being tormented." "We do care," I told her, "and your help has made a real difference." but maybe we can work together to find better ways to protect students. Over several evening conversations, Chiaki and I developed a more subtle system of supernatural intervention. Instead of moving shoes to completely different lockers, she would make small adjustments that disrupted bullying without creating obvious evidence of paranormal activity. She might slightly loosen shoelaces so students would need extra time to properly retie them, causing delays that interfered with harassment timing. Or, she would leave protective omamori charms near the lockers of vulnerable students, providing spiritual protection without direct intervention. Most effectively, she began influencing the bullies themselves, creating minor distractions or discomfort that made them lose interest in harassment. Older students would approach victims, but then suddenly remember forgotten homework or feel compelled to use the restroom, disrupting their intimidation routines. The supernatural interventions became less noticeable but more effective. Bullying incidents in the shoe locker area decreased significantly, though most students attributed the improvement to increased teacher supervision rather than ghostly protection. During my conversations with Chiaki, I learned that her spirit was trapped not just by her traumatic death, but by her ongoing concern for vulnerable students. She couldn't find peace while knowing that other children were experiencing the same harassment that had driven her to suicide. Every time I see a student being bullied, she explained, I remember how alone I felt, how nobody seemed to notice or care what was happening to me. I can't bear to watch others go through that same isolation. I began working with school counselors to improve anti-bullying programs and create better reporting systems for harassment. While I couldn't directly credit Chiaki's supernatural intervention, her insights helped me understand the psychological dynamics of school bullying from a victim's perspective. By the end of my first year, the shoe locker area had become significantly safer for vulnerable students. Chiaki's protective presence remained, but her interventions became more focused on prevention rather than reactive protection. I still find my shoes in unexpected locations occasionally, usually during periods when academic stress or social tension increases bullying incidents. Chiaki's spirit continues watching over students who remind her of her younger self, providing invisible protection for those who need it most. Sometimes I see other first-year students looking puzzled as they search for relocated shoes, and I quietly explain that someone is looking out for them. I don't mention ghosts or supernatural intervention. I simply tell them that our school has a guardian who understands what it's like to be afraid and alone. Chiaki's death was a tragedy that revealed serious problems with our school's anti-bullying measures. But her spiritual presence has created positive changes that protect living students from experiencing the same torment that cost her life. The ghost in our shoe lockers serves as a reminder that bullying has consequences that extend beyond graduation. Some wounds run so deep they persist even beyond death, but they can also inspire protection for future victims. Every morning when I change my shoes, I offer a quiet prayer for Chiaki's peace and for the safety of vulnerable students throughout our school. Her supernatural intervention taught me that protection can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes those who have suffered the most become the strongest advocates for others facing similar challenges. The Science Lab Experiment. My name is Sasaki Hiroto, and I've been teaching chemistry at Meiji Technical High School for 12 years. What I'm about to share happened during the spring semester of 2023, and it fundamentally changed how I understand both scientific dedication and the dangerous extremes of academic pressure. Even now, 9 months later, I never work alone in the lab after hours, and I can never mix certain chemicals without remembering the ghost who taught me that some experiments should never be completed. Meiji Technical High is a specialized school focused on science and engineering education, preparing students for competitive university programs and technical careers. Our chemistry lab is well equipped with modern safety features, fume hoods, and emergency protocols that reflect the serious nature of our experimental work. The lab had been the site of a tragic accident 2 years earlier, during the spring of 2021. A third-year student, named Watanabe Daisuke, had been working on an independent research project after school hours when a chemical reaction went catastrophically wrong. The explosion killed him instantly and caused significant damage to the lab equipment and ventilation systems. Daisuke had been one of our most promising students, brilliant, dedicated, and obsessively focused on achieving perfect experimental results. His parents were both research scientists who had high expectations for his academic performance and pushed him to compete in national science fairs and academic competitions. According to the investigation, Daisuke had been attempting to synthesize a complex organic compound for his science fair project, working with chemicals that required expert supervision. He had stayed late after regular lab hours, apparently trying to perfect his synthesis technique through repeated trials. The accident occurred when he mixed reagents in an incorrect sequence, creating an unstable reaction that exploded before he could implement proper safety measures. Security footage showed him working alone without proper protective equipment, driven by the kind of desperate perfectionism that can make brilliant students take dangerous risks. After extensive repairs and safety upgrades, the lab reopened for the current school year. But from the beginning, I noticed irregularities in our experimental procedures that suggested something wasn't right. Chemical supplies would be found in wrong locations, as if someone had been conducting unauthorized experiments during off hours. Precisely measured reagents would show slight variations in quantity, and equipment settings would be adjusted beyond the parameters I had established for class experiments. Initially, I assumed these discrepancies were caused by students conducting additional experiments during study periods or cleaning staff accidentally disturbing laboratory setups, but the patterns were too systematic and technically sophisticated to be random interference. The first clear supernatural incident occurred in early March during my preparation for an advanced organic chemistry demonstration. I was setting up a multi-step synthesis reaction when I noticed that someone had already begun the procedure, progressing through several stages with remarkable precision. All the glassware was properly arranged, reagents were measured to exact specifications, and the reaction was proceeding at optimal temperature and timing. But no students were present, and no other teachers had access to my specific experimental protocols. As I watched, the reaction continued autonomously, solutions changing color, precipitates forming, and separation techniques executing themselves with invisible hands, manipulating the equipment. The experimental technique was flawless, demonstrating a level of skill that exceeded most of my advanced students. When I called out, "Who's conducting this experiment?" the autonomous activity stopped immediately, leaving behind perfectly executed chemical procedures that would have required hours of careful work to complete. Over the following weeks, I began finding evidence of increasingly complex, unauthorized experiments being conducted in the lab overnight. Sophisticated synthesis reactions would be set up and completed, with detailed notes written in handwriting I recognized as Daisuke's, documenting procedures and results with obsessive precision. The phantom experiments were technically brilliant, but increasingly dangerous. Daisuke's spirit was attempting reactions that required expert supervision and safety protocols, using volatile chemicals in combinations that could easily recreate the explosion that had killed him. During one particularly disturbing incident, I arrived at school to find the lab filled with toxic fumes from an overnight reaction that had been left running without proper ventilation. Emergency procedures had to be implemented to clear the air and neutralize dangerous chemical residues. I realized that Daisuke's ghost was trapped in the same perfectionist loop that had led to his death, conducting increasingly risky experiments in pursuit of flawless results, unable to accept limitations or prioritize safety over achievement. That evening, I stayed late to confront whatever supernatural presence was endangering our lab. Around 10 p.m., when the building was mostly empty, I saw him working at the same bench where the fatal accident had occurred. Daisuke appeared exactly as I remembered him: intense concentration, meticulous attention to detail, completely absorbed in his experimental work. But his form had the pale, driven quality of someone whose perfectionism had become an obsession stronger than self-preservation. He was conducting the same synthesis reaction that had killed him, repeatedly attempting to perfect the procedure that had proven fatal. His movements were precise but desperate, reflecting the impossible pressure he had felt to achieve perfect experimental results. "Daisuke," I said quietly, "you need to stop these experiments. They're dangerous." He looked up from his work with surprise and frustration. "Sasaki-sensei, I'm so close to getting the synthesis perfect. Just a few more trials, and I'll have the exact conditions needed for optimal yield and purity. My parents are expecting results that will qualify for the National Science Fair." "Your parents aren't expecting anything anymore," I told him gently. "The accident happened 2 years ago. You don't need to perfect this experiment." His expression became confused and distressed. "But I can't present imperfect results. Every variable needs to be optimized, every yield maximized. Scientific excellence requires absolute precision, and I haven't achieved that yet." I realized that Daisuke's spirit was trapped not just by his traumatic death, but by the perfectionist standards that had driven him to take fatal risks. His dedication to scientific excellence had become a spiritual prison that prevented him from accepting realistic limitations. "Science isn't about achieving perfection," I explained. "It's about learning from experiments, including failed ones. Your results don't have to be perfect to be valuable." But Daisuke remained fixated on completing his synthesis with flawless technique. Every great scientist achieved breakthrough results through relentless experimentation. "I have to keep trying until I get it exactly right." Our conversations continued over several weeks, with Daisuke gradually beginning to understand that his pursuit of perfect experimental results had become self-destructive. But changing his spiritual approach to scientific work proved difficult. His identity was completely tied to achieving laboratory excellence. During one particularly intense discussion, he admitted that his experimental obsession had developed from family pressure rather than genuine scientific curiosity. "My parents always said that mediocre results weren't acceptable, that real scientists never settled for good enough. I internalized that standard until anything less than perfection felt like failure." I began helping Daisuke understand that scientific progress comes from collaboration, peer review, and gradual improvement, rather than isolated pursuit of perfect results. Real laboratory work involves safety protocols, failed experiments, and learning from mistakes, none of which his perfectionist approach had allowed. Gradually, his phantom experiments became less dangerous and more focused on understanding chemical principles rather than achieving flawless synthesis. Instead of conducting risky reactions alone, he began observing my classroom demonstrations and providing insights about experimental techniques. His supernatural presence actually improved my teaching, as he could identify subtle errors in student procedures and suggest corrections that enhanced learning outcomes. His obsessive attention to detail became helpful rather than destructive when channeled toward education rather than personal achievement. But Daisuke's spirit remained bound to the lab, unable to find complete peace while surrounded by the chemical equipment and experimental opportunities that had defined his identity. His dedication to science was so fundamental that death hadn't diminished his need to conduct research. I worked with the school's Buddhist chaplain to perform memorial services that honored Daisuke's scientific contributions, while acknowledging the pressure that had led to his death. We also established new safety protocols that prevent students from conducting unsupervised experiments after regular hours. The lab now has enhanced monitoring systems and mandatory safety training that emphasizes the importance of seeking help rather than attempting dangerous procedures alone. Daisuke's accident serves as a powerful reminder that scientific achievement should never come at the cost of basic safety. His ghostly presence has become a teaching tool rather than a source of danger. During complex demonstrations, sensitive students sometimes report feeling guided toward correct procedures or warned away from potential mistakes. I interpret this as Daisuke's spirit channeling his perfectionist tendencies toward protecting rather than endangering students. Sometimes I find detailed notes about experimental improvements written in his handwriting, offering suggestions for enhancing our laboratory procedures or curriculum. His insights are valuable, reflecting the kind of deep chemical understanding that made him such a promising student. The phantom experiments have largely ceased, replaced by Daisuke's more constructive involvement in our educational mission. His spirit seems to have found purpose in helping other students develop scientific skills without repeating his dangerous mistakes. But I remain vigilant about students who show signs of the same perfectionist pressure that trapped Daisuke's spirit. When I see students staying too late, attempting overly complex procedures, or showing signs of academic desperation, I intervene early to provide support and perspective. The ghost in our chemistry lab serves as a permanent reminder that scientific excellence should enhance life rather than replace it. Daisuke's death was a tragedy that revealed the dangers of unchecked academic pressure, but his continued presence helps protect current students from similar fates. Every time I conduct a demonstration or supervise student experiments, I'm aware that scientific education carries responsibilities beyond just teaching technical skills. We must also teach balance, safety, and the understanding that imperfect results don't diminish human worth. Daisuke's spirit finally found peace not through achieving perfect experimental results, but through discovering that his scientific knowledge could serve others rather than just satisfying impossible personal standards. The Library Study Carrel. My name is Watanabe Reiko, and I was a library monitor at Sakura University during my third year in 2023. What I'm about to share happened during the final exam period in January, and it changed not only how I understand academic dedication, but how I see the deadly consequences of studying beyond human limits. Even now, 10 months later, I never work alone in the library after midnight, and I can never see someone studying in isolation without remembering the ghost who taught me that some forms of commitment can literally kill. Sakura University's library is a 6-story building that serves as the academic heart of our campus. The 4th floor contains individual study carrels, small, enclosed spaces where students can focus intensively on exam preparation and research projects. Each carrel has a desk, chair, and small shelf for books, creating a private study environment that many students prefer during high-stress periods. As a library monitor, I worked evening and weekend shifts, helping students find resources and maintaining order in study areas. The position provided valuable work experience and helped cover my living expenses, which was important since my family couldn't afford to fully support my university education. During exam periods, the library stayed open 24 hours to accommodate students' intensive study schedules. The overnight hours were typically quiet, with only the most dedicated or desperate students working through the night to prepare for crucial exams. It was during one of these late-night shifts in January that I first encountered signs of supernatural activity in Study Carrel 27 on the 4th floor. This particular carrel had been the site of a tragedy the previous year, though the incident wasn't widely discussed by university administration. In January of 2022, a 4th-year student named Kojima Masako had been found dead in Carrel 27 during final exam week. She had been preparing for graduate school entrance exams and had apparently been studying continuously for several days without adequate rest or nutrition. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, brought on by severe exhaustion and dehydration. According to the reports I'd read, Masako had been discovered by morning cleaning staff, slumped over her books with her hand still holding a pencil. Her study materials were meticulously organized around her color-coded notes, perfectly arranged textbooks, and detailed study schedules that documented her plan to review every subject multiple times before her exams. The Carrel had been cleaned and returned to use after a brief memorial period, but students seemed instinctively reluctant to study there. During my evening rounds, I often found Carrel 27 empty, even when other study spaces were completely occupied. But in January of 2023, exactly 1 year after Masako's death, I began noticing unusual activity in the supposedly vacant Carrel. During my late-night security checks, I would find study materials arranged on the desk, textbooks open to specific pages, notes organized in neat piles, and pencils sharpened to perfect points. Initially, I assumed students were using the Carrel and simply cleaning up so thoroughly that they left no trace of occupancy. But the study setups were too elaborate and systematic to be normal student organization. The materials were arranged with obsessive precision that suggested hours of careful preparation. The books selected for the phantom study sessions covered multiple academic subjects: literature, history, mathematics, and sciences, as if someone was preparing for comprehensive examinations that required mastery of diverse fields. The notes were written in handwriting I didn't recognize, documenting study strategies and memorization techniques with remarkable detail. During one particularly quiet night shift in late January, I decided to monitor Carrel 27 more closely. I positioned myself at a nearby desk where I could observe the study space while pretending to work on inventory tasks. Around 2 a.m., I saw her. Masako was sitting in the Carrel, completely absorbed in her studying. She appeared exactly as she must have during her final weeks: thin from poor eating habits, pale from lack of sleep, but intensely focused on her academic work. Her movements had the mechanical quality of someone who had been studying so long that it had become an automatic behavior. She was conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive review session, moving systematically through different subjects according to a strict schedule. Every few minutes, she would consult a detailed timetable and switch to different materials, maintaining the kind of rigid study routine that many students adopt during exam periods. But there was something disturbing about her dedication. She never paused to rest, never seemed to notice her physical discomfort, and never looked up from her books. Her studying had the quality of compulsive behavior rather than purposeful learning. "Excuse me," I said quietly, approaching the Carrel. Masako looked up with the startled expression of someone who had been deeply concentrated. Her eyes had the hollow, desperate quality I recognized from students under extreme academic pressure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I know it's late, but I need to finish this review session. My graduate school exams are next week, and I'm behind on my study schedule." "Masako-san," I said gently, "your exams were a year ago. You don't need to study anymore." Her expression became confused and agitated. "But I haven't finished preparing. There are still subjects I need to review, practice tests I haven't completed. I can't take the exams until I've mastered all the material." I realized that Masako's spirit was trapped in the same study cycle that had killed her, unable to accept that her academic preparation was complete or that her exams were no longer relevant. Her death hadn't freed her from the pressure to study it, had made that pressure eternal. Over the following weeks, I began observing Masako's ghostly study sessions more regularly. Her routine never varied. She would arrive at the Carrel around midnight and study continuously until dawn, following the same systematic review schedule that had characterized her final weeks alive. But her supernatural presence began affecting other students who used nearby study spaces. Students working in adjacent Carrels reported feeling compelled to study longer and more intensively than they had planned. They would arrive for brief review sessions and find themselves trapped in marathon study periods that left them exhausted and disoriented. The phenomenon seemed to be spreading Masako's academic obsession to vulnerable students who were already under significant exam pressure. Her ghostly dedication was creating a field of compulsive studying that affected anyone who spent extended time near Carrel 27. During one particularly concerning incident, I found 3 students who had been studying in the area for over 18 hours straight, having apparently forgotten to eat, sleep, or even take basic breaks. They were exhibiting signs of the same exhaustion that had killed Masako: dehydration, confusion, and dangerous levels of physical stress. "I can't stop studying," one of them told me when I approached. "Every time I think about taking a break, I remember how much material I still need to review. There's always more to learn, more to memorize." I realized that Masako's spirit was unconsciously sharing her fatal study habits with other students, creating supernatural study sessions that could reproduce the conditions that had led to her death. That evening, I stayed after my shift ended to speak with Masako directly about the effects her presence was having on living students. "You're making other students sick," I told her as she conducted her nightly review session. "They're studying so intensively that they're endangering their health, just like you did." Her expression became troubled. "But academic success requires total dedication. You can't achieve excellent results without sacrificing comfort and convenience. These students need to understand that real achievement demands everything. Academic success shouldn't cost your life," I replied. "Your death proved that excessive studying can be deadly." Masako looked genuinely confused by this concept, but I was so close to being perfectly prepared. Just a few more hours of study, and I would have mastered everything. Death interrupted my preparation, but it didn't change the fact that excellence requires complete commitment. I began having regular conversations with Masako about healthy study habits and the importance of balance in academic work. She was intelligent enough to understand the logic of my arguments, but emotionally unable to accept that her extreme dedication had been harmful rather than admirable. "My parents sacrificed everything for my education," she explained during one conversation. "My professors had high expectations for my graduate school performance. How could I settle for adequate preparation when excellence was possible through just a little more effort?" Gradually, I helped Masako understand that her academic perfectionism had become a form of self-harm rather than genuine learning. Her death hadn't resulted from insufficient dedication. It had resulted from excessive dedication that ignored basic human needs. Our discussions seemed to reduce the supernatural influence affecting other students. Masako's study sessions became less compulsive and more reflective, focusing on understanding rather than endless memorization. She began encouraging students to take breaks, eat properly, and maintain healthy study schedules rather than pushing them toward dangerous extremes. Her presence in the library became protective rather than harmful, helping students recognize when their academic pressure was becoming self-destructive. But Masako's spirit remained bound to the study Carrel, unable to find complete peace while surrounded by the academic environment that had defined her identity. Her dedication to learning was so fundamental that death hadn't diminished her need to study. I worked with university counseling services to improve support for students under extreme academic pressure. While I couldn't directly credit Masako's influence, her insights helped identify warning signs of dangerous study habits and develop intervention strategies for students at risk. The library now has mandatory break policies during exam periods, with staff trained to recognize signs of excessive studying and health-threatening academic behavior. Carrel 27 has been converted into a resource center, where students can access information about healthy study techniques and stress management. Masako's ghostly presence has become an educational tool rather than a source of contagion. During intensive study periods, sensitive students sometimes report feeling guided toward balanced approaches to exam preparation or warned away from dangerous study habits. Sometimes I find notes written in her handwriting, offering encouragement to struggling students, reminding them that their worth isn't determined by their academic performance and that health should never be sacrificed for grades. Her spirit seems to have found purpose in protecting students from repeating her fatal mistakes, channeling her academic dedication toward helping rather than harming vulnerable young people facing similar pressures. The ghost in our library study, Carrel, serves as a permanent reminder that academic achievement should enhance life rather than replace it. Masako's death was a tragedy that revealed the deadly potential of unchecked academic pressure, but her continued presence helps protect current students from similar fates. Every time I conduct evening rounds, I'm reminded that educational institutions have responsibilities beyond just providing study spaces. We must also protect students from the excessive pressures that can make academic dedication deadly. The Rooftop Garden. My name is Hayashi Akiko, and I was vice president of the gardening club at Miyama Girls High School during my third year in 2023. What I'm about to share happened during our spring planting season, and it changed not only how I understand gardening, but how I see the deadly consequences of social shame and family expectations in Japanese society. Even now, 8 months later, I can never tend plants without thinking about growth and death, and I can never forget the ghost who taught me that some forms of social rejection can literally kill hope. Miyama Girls High is a conservative private school in suburban Tokyo, known for its strict moral standards and traditional values. Our school emphasizes academic achievement and proper behavior, with little tolerance for students who violate social expectations or bring shame to the institution's reputation. The gardening club met on the school's rooftop, where we maintained small vegetable plots and flower gardens as part of our environmental education program. The rooftop provided excellent sunlight and served as a peaceful retreat from academic pressures, allowing students to connect with nature in an otherwise urban environment. Our club was small but dedicated, consisting of about 8 members who genuinely enjoyed working with plants and learning about sustainable agriculture. As vice president, I helped coordinate our planting schedules and maintenance routines, ensuring our gardens remained healthy throughout the growing seasons. But the rooftop had been the site of a tragedy 2 years earlier, during the spring semester of 2021. A second-year student named Sato Tomoko had committed suicide by jumping from the roof after discovering she was pregnant and facing the devastating social consequences of teenage pregnancy in our conservative school environment. According to the reports I'd read, Tomoko had become pregnant during a relationship with a university student she'd met through a part-time job. When she discovered her condition, she faced an impossible situation. Abortion was expensive and required parental consent, but revealing her pregnancy would result in family shame, school expulsion, and complete social ostracism. Tomoko's death had shocked our school community and forced uncomfortable conversations about sexual education and support for students facing personal crises. But the institutional response had been limited, focusing more on preventing similar incidents through stricter behavioral monitoring than addressing the underlying social pressures that had driven her to suicide. During our spring planting in April of 2023, I began noticing irregularities in our rooftop garden that suggested someone else was tending the plants during off hours. Seedlings would be repositioned overnight, soil would be disturbed in systematic patterns, and watering schedules would be disrupted by mysterious irrigation that occurred when no club members were present. Initially, I assumed other students were using the rooftop space for unauthorized activities, or that maintenance staff were interfering with our garden plots. But the changes to our plants were too careful and knowledgeable to be random interference. Someone with genuine gardening experience was working in our space. The mysterious gardening became more obvious. As weeks passed, I would arrive for morning club activities to find that someone had been conducting extensive plant care during the night, weeding, pruning, and replanting with techniques that demonstrated sophisticated horticultural knowledge. But despite this careful attention, the plants being tended by our phantom gardener were not thriving. Instead, they were withering and dying in patterns that made no agricultural sense. Healthy seedlings would turn brown overnight, flowering plants would lose their blooms prematurely, and even hardy vegetables would show signs of mysterious disease. The contrast was striking. Our phantom gardener clearly knew proper plant care techniques, but everything she touched seemed to wither and decay, regardless of the quality of care provided. During one early morning visit in late April, I arrived at the rooftop before sunrise to investigate the mysterious gardening activities. In the dim pre-dawn light, I saw her working among our vegetable plots. Tomoko was kneeling in the soil, carefully tending to a row of tomato seedlings, with the kind of gentle attention that experienced gardeners develop. She was wearing her school uniform, but her appearance had the pale, sorrowful quality of someone carrying unbearable emotional weight. Her gardening technique was perfect: proper spacing, careful watering, gentle handling of delicate roots. But as I watched, the plants she touched began to brown and wither, as if her very presence was draining their life force. "Tomoko-san," I said quietly, approaching her slowly. She looked up with surprise and embarrassment, as if she'd been caught doing something shameful. "I'm sorry, Hayashi-san. I know I'm not supposed to be here anymore. I wanted to try growing something. I wanted to create life instead of destroying it." "You're not destroying anything," I replied. "You're trying to take care of the plants." Her expression became deeply sad. "But nothing I touch can survive. Every seed I plant dies, every flower I tend wilts. It's like the shame and death inside me poisons everything I try to nurture." I realized that Tomoko's spirit was trapped not just by her traumatic death, but by the internalized shame and self-hatred that had driven her to suicide. She believed her pregnancy and social failure had made her toxic to everything pure and growing. Over the following weeks, I began having regular conversations with Tomoko during her nightly gardening sessions. She would appear around midnight and work until dawn, desperately trying to coax life from plants that seemed doomed to wither under her care. "I keep thinking that if I can successfully grow something," she explained during one conversation, "it would prove that I'm not completely worthless, that despite what happened to me, I still have the ability to create rather than destroy." "What happened to you wasn't your fault," I told her. "Getting pregnant doesn't make you worthless or toxic." But Tomoko remained convinced that her pregnancy and suicide had contaminated her spiritual essence. "My parents were so ashamed they couldn't even attend my funeral properly. My teacher said my behavior had disgraced the school. How can someone who brought such shame to everyone she loved expect to nurture new life?" Her ghostly presence began affecting the entire rooftop garden, not just the plants she directly tended. Other club members noticed that our cultivation efforts were becoming less successful, with higher rates of plant disease and mysterious crop failures that couldn't be explained by weather or soil conditions. The supernatural blight seemed to be spreading Tomoko's internalized shame throughout our gardening space, creating an environment where healthy growth became increasingly difficult. During one particularly concerning incident, several club members working in the garden became overwhelmed with feelings of guilt and unworthiness that seemed to come from nowhere. They began questioning their own value and expressing self-hatred that mirrored Tomoko's psychological state. I realized that Tomoko's spirit was unconsciously sharing her shame and self-rejection with vulnerable students who spent time in the rooftop space. Her supernatural presence was creating a field of self-destruction that affected anyone exposed to her emotional contamination. I consulted with our school's counseling staff about the situation, describing it in terms of students experiencing shame-related psychological distress, rather than mentioning supernatural activity. The counselors provided information about the psychological effects of social ostracism and the particular vulnerability of teenage girls to shame-based mental health problems. Using this guidance, I began helping Tomoko understand that her feelings of shame and worthlessness were responses to social rejection rather than accurate assessments of her personal value. "Society failed you," I told her during one of our conversations. The shame you feel belongs to the people who rejected you when you needed support, not to you for becoming pregnant. Gradually, our discussions seemed to reduce the supernatural blight affecting the garden. As Tomoko began to question her internalized shame, the plants she tended showed signs of improvement. Her ghostly presence became less toxic and more genuinely nurturing. But the healing process was slow and difficult. Tomoko's self-hatred was deeply rooted in cultural messages about female purity, family honor, and social conformity that couldn't be easily overcome through rational conversation. Even if I understand intellectually that I wasn't worthless, she said, I still feel the shame in my bones. The judgment of my family, my teachers, my classmates, it became part of who I am. I began incorporating memorial practices into our gardening activities, creating a small shrine area where club members could offer prayers for students who had suffered from social rejection and shame. The ritual seemed to provide some comfort to Tomoko's spirit, while educating current students about the deadly consequences of social ostracism. Our rooftop garden gradually returned to health as Tomoko's supernatural influence became more balanced and less destructive. Her presence transformed from a source of blight into a reminder of the importance of compassion and acceptance for students facing personal crises. She began successfully tending certain hardy plants that could tolerate the residual sadness in her spiritual essence, plants that grew slowly but persistently, reflecting her own gradual healing process. The Memorial Garden section became a space where students could reflect on social pressures and the importance of supporting rather than rejecting peers facing difficulties. Tomoko's story, shared in general terms, served as a powerful reminder of how social shame can literally kill vulnerable young people. Sometimes I find small offerings left at our memorial shrine, flowers, written prayers, or personal items from students dealing with their own shame and social pressure. I believe Tomoko's spirit helps provide comfort to students who feel rejected or worthless due to social judgment. The ghost in our rooftop garden serves as a permanent reminder that social acceptance and compassion can be matters of life and death. Tomoko's tragedy revealed the deadly potential of family shame and institutional rejection, but her continued presence helps protect current students from similar fates. Every planting season, I dedicate part of our garden to memorial plants that honor students who have suffered from social rejection. The practice helps keep Tomoko's memory alive, while educating new students about the importance of acceptance and support for peers facing personal crises. The Principal's Office. My name is Suzuki Masato, and I've served as Vice Principal at Konan High School for 7 years. What I'm about to tell you happened during the spring semester of 2023, and it fundamentally changed how I understand both school discipline and the deadly consequences of institutional injustice. Even now, 9 months later, I never work alone in the administrative offices after dark, and I can never review student disciplinary files without remembering the ghost who taught me that some accusations can literally destroy lives. Konan High is a mid-tier public school serving a diverse student population in suburban Tokyo. As vice principal, I handle most disciplinary matters, working closely with teachers and parents to address behavioral problems while maintaining the school's academic standards and reputation. The principal's office, where I conduct most serious disciplinary meetings, had been the site of a tragic confrontation 2 years earlier, during the spring of 2021. A third-year student named Tanaka Noboru had been called to the office to face allegations of cheating on his university entrance exam practice test, accusations that ultimately led to his suspension and probable expulsion. Noboru had been an exemplary student with no previous disciplinary issues, but evidence suggested he had accessed exam questions in advance through unauthorized means. The case seemed clear-cut, based on the documentation provided by his mathematics teacher, Watanabe Sensei, who had reported suspicious behavior and unusually perfect test scores. Facing academic expulsion just months before graduation, Noboru had denied the charges desperately, but was unable to provide convincing evidence of his innocence. The prospect of losing his educational future and bringing shame to his family proved overwhelming. He committed suicide that same evening, leaving behind a note proclaiming his innocence and expressing devastation that no one believed him. The tragedy had haunted our school community, leading to reviews of our disciplinary procedures and increased attention to student mental health support. But the case itself was never reopened. Noboru's death was treated as the unfortunate consequence of academic pressure rather than a sign that our investigation might have been flawed. During the spring of 2023, I began experiencing unusual disturbances during my late-night administrative work. Student files would be found scattered across my desk each morning, organized in patterns that suggested someone had been conducting thorough reviews of disciplinary records during off hours. The scattered files consistently focused on cases involving academic dishonesty allegations, particularly those where students had faced severe consequences, like suspension or expulsion. It was as if someone was conducting a comprehensive audit of our disciplinary decisions, looking for patterns or inconsistencies in our investigation procedures. Initially, I assumed the disturbances were caused by cleaning staff or security personnel accidentally disrupting my organized files. But the arrangements were too systematic and purposeful to be random interference. Someone with detailed knowledge of our disciplinary system was examining these records with investigative intent. The phantom file reviews became more obvious as weeks passed. I would arrive at my office to find complex displays of documentation spread across multiple desks, with connecting lines drawn between related cases and detailed notes written in margins. The handwriting looked familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen it before. Most disturbing was that these supernatural investigations seemed to be revealing actual problems with our disciplinary procedures. Cases I'd considered closed were being re-examined with evidence I'd overlooked, inconsistencies I'd dismissed, and procedural errors that cast doubt on our conclusions. During one morning arrival in late April, I found Noboru's original disciplinary file at the center of an elaborate display of related documentation. His case had been connected to several other academic dishonesty allegations handled by the same teacher, Watanabe-sensei, with notes highlighting similarities in the evidence and investigation methods. The ghostly analysis suggested that Watanabe-sensei might have been fabricating cheating allegations against students he disliked or who challenged his authority. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Students who questioned his teaching methods or performed better than expected were more likely to face dishonesty accusations. That evening, I decided to stay late and investigate the supernatural activity directly. If Noboru's spirit was trying to communicate something about his case, I needed to understand what evidence he was attempting to present. Around 10 p.m., when the building was mostly empty, I saw him working at my desk. Noboru appeared exactly as he had during our final disciplinary meeting. Nervous but determined, wearing his school uniform with the careful precision of someone trying to make a good impression under terrible circumstances. He was systematically reviewing disciplinary files, making detailed comparisons between cases, and documenting irregularities with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his academic work when alive. "Noboru," I said quietly, approaching my desk. He looked up with the same mixture of hope and desperation I remembered from our last meeting. "Suzuki-sensei, I've been trying to show you the truth about what happened. I wasn't cheating. I was being framed by Watanabe-sensei because I questioned his grading methods." "What evidence do you have?" I asked, sitting across from him as if we were continuing the disciplinary meeting that had ended with his suspension. Noboru began presenting his supernatural investigation with remarkable clarity and organization. He had identified multiple students who had faced similar accusations from Watanabe-sensei, all of whom shared common characteristics They were academically capable students who had challenged the teacher's authority or methodology. "Look at the pattern," he said, showing me files arranged chronologically. Every student Watanabe-sensei accused of cheating had previously questioned his teaching in class or received grades they disputed. The accusations weren't based on actual evidence of dishonesty, they were retaliation for perceived disrespect. His ghostly analysis revealed sophisticated manipulation of evidence, including fabricated witness statements and altered test documents that I had accepted without sufficient verification. Watanabe-sensei had been systematically targeting students who threatened his classroom authority, using cheating accusations as weapons to eliminate challenges to his power. "Why didn't you present this evidence during your disciplinary hearing?" I asked. His expression became frustrated and sad. "I tried to explain the pattern, but you said I was making excuses." You believed Watanabe-sensei's documentation without investigating whether it was accurate. I was just a student facing a teacher's word nobody believed. I was capable of uncovering systematic fraud. I realized that our disciplinary system had fundamental flaws that prevented students from effectively defending themselves against false accusations. We had prioritized administrative efficiency over thorough investigation, accepting teacher allegations without adequate verification. Over the following weeks, Noboru's spirit continued presenting evidence of institutional problems with our disciplinary procedures. His supernatural investigation was more thorough and objective than our original administrative review, revealing systemic issues that had allowed corrupt practices to continue undetected. But his ghostly presence also created practical complications. Other staff members began reporting strange disturbances in the administrative offices, with files being mysteriously rearranged and disciplinary records appearing in unexpected locations. The supernatural activity was making normal administrative work difficult. I consulted with the school's Buddhist chaplain about the situation, explaining that we appeared to be dealing with a spirit seeking justice for institutional failures. The chaplain suggested that supernatural unrest often continues until underlying wrongs are acknowledged and corrected. Using Noboru's posthumous investigation as guidance, I began reviewing all disciplinary cases handled by Watanabe-sensei during his tenure at our school. The pattern of retaliation and evidence fabrication was clear once I knew what to look for, but it had been hidden by institutional assumptions about teacher credibility and student dishonesty. I presented my findings to the principal and school board, recommending a formal review of Watanabe-sensei's disciplinary allegations and implementation of stronger verification procedures for academic misconduct cases. The investigation revealed systematic abuse of disciplinary authority that had affected multiple students over several years. Watanabe-sensei was eventually dismissed, and several students who had been falsely accused received formal apologies and record corrections. Noboru's case was officially reopened, and his academic standing was posthumously restored with acknowledgement that he had been wrongly accused. The institutional reforms seemed to provide some peace to Noboru's spirit. His supernatural file rearrangements became less frequent and more focused, occasionally highlighting specific cases that needed additional attention but no longer creating chaotic displays of documentation. Sometimes I find detailed notes written in his handwriting, offering suggestions for improving our disciplinary procedures or identifying potential problems with ongoing investigations. His insights are valuable, reflecting the perspective of someone who experienced our system's failures firsthand. The ghost in our principal's office serves as a permanent reminder that institutional authority must be balanced with fairness and thorough investigation. Noboru's death was a tragedy that revealed serious problems with our disciplinary system, but his continued presence helps protect current students from similar injustices. Every time I review a disciplinary case, I'm aware that accusations can destroy lives if not properly investigated. We've implemented new procedures that require multiple forms of evidence and provide students with better advocacy support during disciplinary proceedings. Noboru's spirit finally found some measure of peace, not through revenge against those who wronged him, but through systematic reforms that prevent future students from facing similar false accusations. His posthumous investigation created positive changes that honor his memory while protecting the living. The empty classroom seats. My name is Watanabe Kenta, and I transferred to Shirakawa High School during my second year in the fall semester of 2023. What I'm about to share happened during my adjustment period at the new school, and it changed not only how I understand classroom dynamics, but how I see the invisible presence of academic trauma that haunts Japanese educational institutions. Even now, 6 months later, I count the occupied desks in every classroom I enter, and I can never sit in silence without listening for voices that shouldn't be there. Shirakawa High is a mid-level public school in suburban Tokyo, serving students from working and middle-class families who face significant pressure to succeed academically despite limited resources. The school has a reputation for pushing students hard toward university entrance exam success, with teachers and administrators emphasizing the life-or-death importance of academic achievement. As a transfer student, I was assigned to Class 2B, a typical second-year classroom with 35 desks arranged in 7 rows of 5. The room had large windows facing the courtyard, fluorescent lighting, and the standard blackboard and teacher's desk arrangement found in most Japanese high schools. My assigned seat was in the 4th row, 3rd position from the window, a middle location that should have provided a good view of lessons while keeping me relatively inconspicuous as I adjusted to the new school environment. But from my first day in Class 2B, I noticed something unusual about the classroom atmosphere. Despite having 35 students enrolled, several desks always appeared empty during lessons. Not consistently the same desks, but usually 3 to 5 seats that seemed unoccupied even when attendance was supposedly full. Initially, I assumed this was normal variation students using the restroom, attending club activities, or meeting with teachers. But as weeks passed, I realized the pattern was too consistent. The same desks would appear empty day after day, even though my classmates acted as if all seats were occupied. During one particularly quiet literature lesson in late October, I noticed something that made me question my perception entirely. Our teacher, Yamada-sensei, was calling attendance, and students were responding present from seats that looked empty to me. "Suzuki-kun," the teacher called. "Hi," came a response from the desk directly behind me, but when I turned around, I saw only an empty chair. The same pattern repeated throughout attendance. Names were called, responses were given, but several of the voices seemed to come from unoccupied desks. My classmates showed no signs of noticing anything unusual. I began paying closer attention to these phantom students during various lessons. While I couldn't see clear figures in the apparently empty seats, I sometimes caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, hands writing notes, heads turning toward the blackboard, subtle shifts in posture that suggested active participation in class activities. The phantom presence became more obvious during exam periods. I would hear pencils scratching against paper from the seemingly empty desks, pages turning, and occasionally the soft sounds of stressed sighs, pencil tapping, or nervous fidgeting that reflected the anxiety all students feel during tests. But there was something deeply unsettling about these invisible classmates. The atmosphere in our classroom felt oppressively heavy, as if weighted down by more emotional pressure than 35 living students could generate. The phantom academic stress was almost tangible. During a particularly difficult mathematics exam in November, the supernatural presence became impossible to ignore. As I struggled with complex calculus problems, I heard quiet crying from multiple directions, not from my visible classmates, but from the areas around apparently empty desks. The weeping had a desperate, hopeless quality that went beyond normal test anxiety. It sounded like students who were completely overwhelmed by academic pressure, facing impossible expectations with inadequate preparation. When I looked around the classroom, My living classmates appeared focused on their exams, showing no signs of hearing the phantom sobbing that was growing louder around me. That evening, I researched the history of our school, looking for information that might explain the supernatural presence in Class 2B. What I found was a pattern of student suicides that had occurred over the past 5 years, all involving second-year students who had been assigned to our specific classroom. The most recent tragedy had occurred in March of 2022, just before my arrival. A student named Kimura Akira had committed suicide after receiving poor grades on his practice university entrance exams. According to the reports, he had been under intense pressure from his family to achieve scores that would qualify him for a prestigious university. Before Akira, there had been Tanaka Yuki in 2021, who had taken her own life after being rejected from her preferred university's early admission program. And before her, Matsuda Hiroshi in 2020, who had died by suicide when his parents discovered he had been attending a juku they couldn't afford by working illegal part-time jobs. Each of these students had died during their second year, when academic pressure typically peaks as students prepare for their final year of high school and university entrance exam preparation. Reading about these tragedies made me realize that the phantom students in Class 2B were the spirits of young people who had been literally killed by academic pressure. They were still attending lessons, still trying to meet impossible expectations, still trapped in the cycle of educational stress that had cost them their lives. During one particularly intense study session before winter exams, I decided to address the supernatural presence directly. As I sat alone in the classroom during after-school study time, I spoke quietly to the empty desks around me. "I know you're here," I said. "I can hear you during lessons, during exams. You're still trying to succeed academically, even though..." A voice responded from the desk behind me, young, male, exhausted. "Even though we're dead? Yes, we're still here. We can't stop studying." The pressure doesn't end just because our hearts stopped beating. Other voices began joining the conversation, coming from various empty seats throughout the classroom. I was hearing from Akira, Yuki, Hiroshi, and 2 other students whose deaths I hadn't found in my research, all of them trapped in eternal academic struggle. "We sit through every lesson," explained Yuki's voice from a desk near the window. "We take every exam. We feel every moment of stress and pressure, but we can never succeed. We can never meet our family's expectations or achieve the scores we need. It's an endless cycle of failure and disappointment." "Why can't you rest?" I asked. "Because we internalize the belief that our worth as people depends on our academic performance," replied Hiroshi from across the room. "Death didn't change that belief. We're still trying to prove we're worthy of our parents' love and society's acceptance." As I continued talking with these phantom students, I began to understand how their presence was affecting the living students in our classroom. Their collective academic anxiety was creating a supernatural field of pressure that intensified the stress experienced by current students. My classmates were unconsciously absorbing the desperation and fear of students who had died from academic pressure, making their own educational experience more psychologically dangerous. Over the following weeks, I noticed that several of my living classmates were showing signs of the same extreme stress that had characterized the phantom students' final weeks. They were studying to the point of exhaustion, expressing suicidal ideation when facing academic setbacks, and demonstrating the kind of perfectionism that can literally be deadly. The ghosts of educational casualties were unconsciously encouraging current students to repeat their fatal patterns. I began having regular conversations with the phantom students, trying to help them understand that their academic worth wasn't determined by test scores or university admissions. But changing their spiritual beliefs about education proved extremely difficult. "Our parents sacrificed everything for our education," Akira's spirit explained during one conversation. "Our teachers told us that academic failure meant life failure. How can we accept that those messages were wrong when they came from every adult authority figure in our lives? I realized that these phantom students were trapped not just by their individual trauma, but by systemic educational pressure that treats student worth as equivalent to academic performance. Working with our school's counseling staff, I began advocating for better mental health support and more balanced approaches to academic achievement. While I couldn't directly mention supernatural activity, I could describe the psychological pressure affecting students in our classroom. The counselors implemented new programs focused on helping students develop identity and self-worth beyond academic performance. They also provided training for teachers about recognizing signs of dangerous academic pressure. These interventions seemed to reduce the supernatural influence affecting living students. As current students developed healthier relationships with academic achievement, the phantom presence became less oppressive and desperate. The ghostly students remained in our classroom, but their influence became less harmful to the living. They began encouraging balance rather than perfectionism, warning students away from the excessive dedication that had killed them. Sometimes during particularly stressful periods, I hear their voices offering comfort to struggling classmates, reminding living students that their value as human beings isn't determined by test scores or university admissions. The empty seats in Class 2B serve as permanent reminders that academic pressure can be literally deadly when taken to extremes. The phantom students continue attending lessons, but now they serve as protective spirits rather than sources of dangerous pressure. Every day when I enter our classroom, I acknowledge the presence of students who paid the ultimate price for educational achievement. Their continued attendance serves as both memorial and warning about the human cost of academic perfectionism.